Mind if I ask what's inside?" Gottschalk's gaze remained on the crate. "An archaeological artifact on its way to a museum," he said vaguely. "Must be valuable," Church probed. Gottschalk did not answer. Something along the edge of the lid struck his eye. He pulled out a pair of reading spectacles and peered through the lenses. His hands trembled and his body stiffened. "It's been opened," he gasped. "Not possible," said Church. "The top is so tightly secured by chains that the links have made indentations on the edges of the wood." "But look here," he said, pointing. "You can see the pry marks where the lid was forced up." "Those scratches were probably caused when the crate was sealed." "They were not there when I checked the crate 2 days ago," said Gottschalk firmly. "Someone in your crew has tampered with it." "You're unduly concerned. What crew member would have any interest in an old artifact that must weigh at least 2 tons? Besides, who else but you has the key to the padlocks?" Gottschalk dropped to his knees and jerked one of the locks. The shackle came off in his hand. Instead of steel, it was carved from wood. He looked frightened now. As if hypnotized, he slowly rose, looked wildly about the cargo compartment, and uttered one word: "Zanona." It was as if he triggered a nightmare. The next 60 seconds were locked in horror. The murder of the consul general happened so quickly that Church could only stand frozen in shock, his mind uncomprehending of what his eyes witnessed. A figure leapt from the shadows onto the top of the crate. He was dressed in the uniform of a Navy seaman, but there was no denying the racial characteristics of his coarse, straight black hair, the prominent cheekbones, the unusually dark, expressionless eyes. Without uttering a sound, the South American Indian plunged a spear-like shaft through Gottschalk's chest until the barbed point protruded nearly a foot beyond the shoulder blades. The consul general did not immediately fall. He slowly turned his head and stared at Church, his eyes wide and devoid of recognition. He tried to say something, but no words came out, only a sickening, gurgling kind of cough that turned his lips and chin red. As he began to sag, the Indian put a foot on his chest and yanked out the spear. Church had never seen the assassin before. The Indian was not one of the Cyclops' crew and could only be a stowaway. There was no malevolence in the brown face, no anger or hate, only an inscrutable expression of total blankness. He grasped the spear almost negligently and silently jumped from the crate. Church braced himself for the onslaught. He deftly sidestepped the spear's thrust and hurled the flashlight at the Indian's face. There was a soft thud as the metal tube smashed into the right jaw, breaking the bone and loosening several teeth. Then he lashed out with his fist and struck the Indian's throat. The spear dropped onto the deck, and Church snapped up the wooden shaft and lifted it above his head. Suddenly the world inside the cargo compartment went mad, and Church found himself fighting to keep his balance as the deck canted nearly 60 degrees. He somehow kept his footing, running downhill with gravity until he reached the slanting forward bulkhead. The Indian's inert body rolled after him, coming to rest at his feet. Then he watched in helpless terror as the crate, unbound by its locks, hurtled across the deck, crushing the Indian and pinning Church's legs against the steel wall. The impact caused the lid to twist half off the crate, revealing the contents. Church dazedly stared inside. The incredible sight that met his eyes under the flickering overhead lights was the final image burned into his mind during the fractional seconds that separated him from death. In the wheelhouse, Captain Worley was witnessing an even more awesome sight. It was as though the Cyclops had abruptly dropped into a fathomless hole. Her bow pitched sharply into an immense trough, and her stern rose steeply into the air until her propellers came clear of the water. Through the gloom ahead, the Cyclops' steaming lights reflected on a seething black wall that rose up and blotted out the stars. Deep in the bowels of the cargo holds came a dreadful rumbling that felt and sounded like an earthquake, causing the entire ship to shudder from stem to stern. Worley never had time to voice the alarm that flashed through his mind. The shorings had given way, and the shifting manganese ore increased the Cyclops' downward momentum. The helmsman stared out the bridge port in mute astonishment as the towering column, the height of a 10-story building, roared toward them with the speed of an avalanche. The top half crested and curled under. 1,000,000 tons of water crashed savagely into the forward part of the ship, completely inundating the bow and superstructure. The doors to the bridge wings shattered, and water shot into the wheelhouse. Worley gripped the counter railing, his paralyzed mind unable to visualize the inevitable. The wave swept over the ship. The entire bow section twisted away as steel beams snapped and the keel buckled. The heavy riveted hull plates were ripped away as if they were paper. The Cyclops plunged deeper under the immense pressure of the wave. Her propellers bit the water again and helped impel her into the waiting depths. The Cyclops could not come back. She kept on going, down, down, until her shattered hull and the people it imprisoned fell against the restless sands of the seafloor below, leaving only a flight of bewildered seagulls to mark her fateful passage. Part 1. The Prospertier. Chapter 1. October 10th, 1989. Key West, Florida. The blimp hung motionless in the tropical air, poised and tranquil, like a fish suspended in an aquarium. Her bow nudged against a yellow mooring mast as she balanced daintily on a single landing wheel. She was a tired-looking old airship. Her once silver skin had wrinkled and turned white, and was spotted by numerous patches. The gondola, the control car that hung beneath her belly, wore an antique boat-like look, and its glass windows were yellowed with age. Only her two 200-horsepower Wright Whirlwind engines appeared new, having been carefully restored to pristine condition. Unlike her younger sister ships that plied the skies above football stadiums, her gas-tight envelope was made from aluminum with riveted seams instead of rubber-coated polyester, and was supported by 12 circular frames like the back of a fish. Her cigar shape was 149 feet in length and held 200,000 cubic feet of helium, and if no headwinds attacked her rotund nose, she could barrel through the clouds at 62 miles an hour. Her original designation was ZMC-2, Zeppelin Metal-Clad No. 2, and she had been constructed in Detroit and turned over to the United States Navy in 1929. Unlike most airships with 4 massive stabilizing fins, she sported 8 small fins on her tapered tail. Very advanced for her era, she had given solid and dependable service until 1942, when she was dismantled and forgotten. For 47 years, the ZMC-2 languished in an abandoned hangar along the runway of a deserted naval air station near Key West, Florida. Then, in 1988, the property was sold by the government to a financial conglomerate headed by a wealthy publisher, Raymond LeBaron, who intended to develop it as a resort. Shortly after arriving from his corporate headquarters in Chicago to inspect the newly purchased naval base, LeBaron stumbled onto the dusty and corroded remains of the ZMC-2 and became intrigued. Charging it off to promotion, he had the old, lighter-than-air craft reassembled and the engines rebuilt, calling her the Prospertier, after the business magazine that was the base of his financial empire, and emblazoning the name in huge red letters on the side of the envelope. LeBaron learned to fly the Prospertier, mastering the fickle moods of the craft and the constant adjustments required to maintain steady flight under the capricious nature of the wind. There was no autopilot to relieve the chore of dipping the bow against a sudden gust and lifting it when the breeze slackened. The near-neutral buoyancy varied greatly with the atmosphere. Residue from a light rain could add hundreds of pounds to the blimp's vast skin, decreasing her ability to lift, while dry air blowing down from the northwest forced the pilot to fight the craft's insistence on rising to an undesired altitude. LeBaron reveled in the challenge. The exhilaration of second-guessing the moods of the antique gas bag and wrestling with her aerodynamic whims far exceeded any enjoyment he received from flying any of the 5 jet aircraft belonging to his corporate holdings. He sneaked away from the boardroom at every opportunity to travel to Key West so he could island hop around the Caribbean. The Prospertier soon became a familiar sight over the Bahama Islands. A native worker, laboring in a sugar-cane field, looked up at the blimp and promptly described her as a little pig running backwards. LeBaron, however, like most entrepreneurs of the power elite, suffered from a restless mind and a driving urge to tackle a new project lying over the next hill. After nearly a year, his interest in the old blimp began to wane. Then one evening in a waterfront saloon, he met an old beach rat by the name of Buck Caesar.
So there goes something right here, Heidi. Check that one out.
Who operated a backwater salvage company with the grandiloquent title Exotic Artifact Ventures, Incorporated. During a conversation over several rounds of iced rum, Caesar spoke the magic word that has fired the human mind into insanity for 5,000 years, and probably caused more grief than half the wars: treasure. After listening to Caesar spin tales of Spanish galleons littering the waters of the Caribbean, their cargoes of gold and silver mingled with the coral, even a shrewd financial manipulator with the acute business sense of LeBaron was hooked. With a handshake, they formed a partnership. LeBaron's interest in the Prospertier was revived. The blimp made a perfect platform for spotting potential shipwreck sites from the air. Airplanes moved too fast for aerial survey, while helicopters had a limited flying time and churned up the surface of the water with wash from their rotor blades. The blimp could remain airborne for 2 days and cruise at a walk. From an altitude of 400 feet, the straight lines of a man-made object could be detected by a sharp eye 100 feet beneath a calm and clear sea. Dawn was crawling over the Florida Straits as the 10-man ground crew assembled around the Prospertier and began a pre-flight inspection. The new sun caught the huge envelope covered by morning dew, giving off an iridescent effect like that from a soap bubble. The blimp stood in the center of a concrete runway whose expansion cracks were lined with weeds. A slight breeze blew in from the straits, and she swung around the mooring mast until her bulbous nose faced into it. Most of the ground crew were young, deeply tanned, and casually dressed in an assortment of shorts, bathing suits, and denim cutoffs. They took scant notice as a Cadillac stretch limousine drove across the runway and stopped at the large truck that served as the blimp's repair shop, crew chief's office, and communications room. The chauffeur opened the door, and LeBaron unlimbered from the rear seat, followed by Buck Caesar, who immediately made for the blimp's gondola with a roll of nautical charts tucked under one arm. LeBaron, looking a very trim and healthy 65, towered above everyone at 6'7". His eyes were the color of light oak, the graying hair combed just so, and he possessed the distant, preoccupied gaze of a man whose thoughts were several hours in the future. He bent down and spoke for a few moments to an attractive woman who leaned from the car. He kissed her lightly on the cheek, closed the car door, and began walking toward the Prospertier. The crew chief, a studious-looking man wearing a spotless white shopcoat, came over and shook LeBaron's outstretched hand. "Fuel tanks are topped off, Mr. LeBaron. The pre-flight checklist is completed." "How's the buoyancy?" "You'll have to adjust for an extra 500 pounds from the dampness." LeBaron nodded thoughtfully. "She'll lighten in the heat of the day. The controls should feel more responsive. The elevator cables were showing signs of rust, so I had them replaced." "What's the weather look like?" "Low scattered clouds most of the day, little chance of rain. You'll be bucking a 5-mile-an-hour headwind from the southeast on the way out." "And a tailwind on the return trip. I prefer that." "Same radio frequency as the last trip?" "Yes, we'll report our position and condition using normal voice communication every half hour. If we spot a promising target, we'll transmit in code." The crew chief nodded. Understood. Without further conversation, LeBaron climbed the ladder to the gondola and settled in the pilot's seat. He was joined by his co-pilot, Joe Cavilla, a 60-year-old, sad-eyed, dour individual who seldom opened his mouth except to yawn or sneeze. His family had immigrated to America from Brazil when he was 16, and he had joined the Navy, flying blimps until the last airship unit was formally disbanded in 1964. Cavilla had simply showed up one day, impressed LeBaron with his expertise in lighter-than-air craft, and was hired. The third member of the crew was Buck Caesar. He wore a constant smile on a gentle, middle-aged face that had the texture of cowhide, but his gaze was shrewd, and the body held the firmness of a boxer. He sat hunched over a small table contemplating his charts, drawing a series of squares near a sector of the Bahama Channel. Blue smoke burst from the exhaust stacks as LeBaron turned over the engines. The ground crew untied a number of canvas sacks containing ballast shot from the gondola. One crewman, the butterfly catcher, held up a windsock on a long pole so LeBaron could note the exact direction of the wind. LeBaron gave a hand signal to the crew chief. A wooden chock was pulled from the landing wheel, the nose coupling was released from the mooring mast, and the men holding the bow ropes heaved to one side and let go. When the airship was free and clear of the mast, LeBaron eased the throttles forward and spun the large elevator wheel next to his seat.
For the meteor shower, right now you have the the southern torrids going on. That's active from September 7th to November 19th. Southern torrids is a long-lasting shower. There's really no maximum. It doesn't really have a peak. So, I mean, it's just like a slow, steady, boring shower. I mean, there's probably like 15, 20 a night. You know, it's not too many. And the object that throws that one off is 2P Anki, however you want to say it. Then you have October 19th to December 10th, you have the northern torrids. You also have November 5th, the Leonids. That's from November 5th to the 30th. The Geminids is also a good one right there. That's December 4th to the 16th. You also have the Ursids, December 17th to the 23rd. That one does about 25 per hour. The parent object on that one is Tuttle. Actually, there's two of them, two Tuttles here. That one is 8P Tuttle for the Ursids, and Leonids is 55P Temple Tuttle.
Prospertier pointed her comic opera snout upward at a 50-degree angle and slowly drove into the sky. The ground crew watched until the huge airship gradually faded from view over the blue-green waters of the Straits. Then their interest turned briefly to the limousine and the vague feminine shape behind the tinted windows. Jessie LeBaron shared her husband's passion for outdoor adventure, but she was an orderly woman who preferred organizing charity balls and political fundraisers over a time-wasting hunt for dubious treasure. Vibrant and bouncy, with a mouth that had a repertory of a dozen different smiles, she was 6 months past 50, but looked closer to 37. Jessie was slightly heavy-bodied but firm. Her facial skin was creamy smooth, and she had allowed her hair to turn a natural salt and pepper. The eyes were large and dark, and bore no trace of the blank look usually left by plastic surgery. When she could no longer see the blimp, Jessie spoke into the limousine's intercom. "Angelo, please drive back to the hotel." The chauffeur, a somber Cuban with the etched face of a postage stamp engraving, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap and nodded. The ground crew watched the long Cadillac turn and head through the deserted front gate of the former naval base. Then someone produced a volleyball. Quickly they drew out the boundaries and set up a net. After choosing up sides, they began batting the ball back and forth to fight the boredom of waiting. Inside the air-conditioned truck, the crew chief and a radio operator acknowledged and recorded the reports from the blimp. LeBaron religiously transmitted every 30 minutes, never varying more than a few seconds, describing his approximate position, any changes in weather, and vessels passing below. Then, at 2:30 in the afternoon, the report stopped. The radio operator tried to raise the Prospertier, but there was no response. 5 o'clock came and went with still no word. Outside, the ground crew wearily ceased their play and crowded around the door to the radio compartment as the uneasiness inside began to grow. At 6 o'clock, with no sign of the blimp over the sea, the crew chief put in a call to the Coast Guard. What no one knew, or possibly suspected, was that Raymond LeBaron and his friends on board the Prospertier had vanished in a mystery that went far beyond any mere treasure hunt. Chapter 2. 10 days later, the President of the United States stared pensively out the window of his limousine at the passing landscape and idly drummed his fingers on one knee. His eyes didn't see the picturesque estates amid the horse country of Potomac, Maryland. He took scant notice of the sun gleaming on the coats of the thoroughbreds roaming the rolling pastures. The images that reflected in his mind coursed around the strange events that had literally hurled him into the White House. As the Vice President, he was sworn into the nation's highest office when his predecessor was forced to resign after admitting to a mental illness. Mercifully, the news media did not launch a full-blown investigation. Of course, there were the routine interviews with White House aides, congressional leaders, and noted psychiatrists, but nothing smelling of intrigue or conspiracy emerged. The former president left Washington and retired to his firm in New Mexico, still respected with great sympathy from the public, and the truth remained locked in the minds of a very few. The new chief executive was an energetic man who stood slightly over 6 feet and weighed a solid 200 pounds. His face was square-jawed, with firm features and a brow that was usually furrowed in a thoughtful frown. Yet his intense gray eyes could be deceptively limpid. The silver hair was always neatly trimmed and parted on the right side in the homespun style of a Kansas banker. He was not handsome or flamboyant in the eyes of the public, but emitted an appealing style and charm. Though he was a professional politician, he somewhat naively viewed the government as a giant team, with himself as the coach who sent in plays during the game. Highly regarded as a mover and shaker, he surrounded himself with a cabinet and staff of gifted men and women who made every effort to work in harmony with Congress, rather than enlisting a band of cronies who were more concerned with fortifying their personal power base. His thoughts slowly focused on the local scenery as his Secret Service driver slowed down and turned off River Road North through a large stone gate bordered by a white rail fence. A uniformed security guard and a Secret Service agent wearing the standard dark sunglasses and business suit stepped from the gatehouse. They simply peered in the car and nodded in recognition. The agent spoke into a small radio transmitter strapped to his wrist like a watch. "The boss is on his way." The limousine rolled up the tree-lined circular drive of the Congressional Country Club, past the tennis courts on the left, teeming with the staring wives of the members, and eased to a stop under the portico of the clubhouse. Elmer Hoskins, the advance man, stepped forward and opened the rear door. "Looks like a good day for golf, Mr. President." "My game couldn't get worse if we were standing in snow," the President said, smiling. "I wish I could shoot in the low 80s. "So do I," said the President as he followed Hoskins around the side of the clubhouse and down to the pro shop. "I've added 5 strokes to my score since taking over the Oval Office. Still, not bad for someone who only plays once a week. That and the fact it becomes increasingly difficult to keep my mind on the game." The club pro came over and shook his hand. "Reggie has your clubs and is waiting on the first tee." The president nodded, and they climbed into a golf cart and set off over a path that curved around a large pond and onto one of the longest golf courses in the nation. Reggie Salazar, a short, wiry Hispanic, stood leaning on a huge leather bag packed with golf clubs that came up to his chest. Salazar's appearance was deceiving. Like a small Andes Mountains burro, he could lug a 50-pound bag of irons around 18 holes without losing a breath or showing a drop of sweat. When he was only a boy of 13, he had carried his ailing mother in his arms with a 3-year-old sister strapped to his back across the California-Baja border, 30 miles to San Diego. After the illegal alien amnesty was granted in 1985, he worked around golf courses, becoming a top caddy on the professional tour. He was a genius at learning the rhythm of a course, claiming it spoke to him, and unerringly picking the right club for a difficult shot. Salazar was also a wit and a philosopher, blurting adages that would have made Casey Stengel envious. The president had drawn him in a congressional tournament 5 years before, and they became good friends. Salazar always dressed like a field laborer, denim jeans, western shirt, GI boots, and a rancher's wide-brimmed straw hat. It was his trademark. "Saludos, Mr. President," he greeted in border English, his dark coffee-brown eyes glistening. "Do you wish to walk or ride the cart?" The president pressed Salazar's outstretched hand. "I could use the exercise, so let's walk for a while and maybe ride the back nine." He teed off and hit a lofting ball with a slight hook that stopped rolling 180 yards up and near the border of the fairway. As he strolled from the tee, the problems of running the country melted away, and his mind began planning the next shot. He played in silence until he dropped his putt in the cup for a par. Then he relaxed and handed his putter to Salazar. "Well, Reggie, any suggestions for dealing with Capitol Hill?" "Too many black ants," Salazar replied with an elastic grin. "Black ants?" "Everyone wear dark suits and run crazy. All they make is paper and wave tongues. Me, I'd write laws saying Congress people could only meet every other year. That way they'd cause less trouble." The president laughed. "I can think of at least 200 million voters who would applaud your idea." They continued along the course, followed at a discreet distance by 2 Secret Service agents in a golf cart, while at least a dozen others prowled the course grounds. The banter remained cheerful as the president's game went smoothly. After he retrieved the ball from the cup on the 9th green, his score tallied 39. He considered it a major triumph. "Let's take a break before we attack the back nine," said the president. "I'm going to celebrate with a beer. Care to join me?" "No, thank you, sir. I'll use the time to clean grass and dirt from your clubs." The president handed him the putter. "Suit yourself. But I must insist you join me for a drink after we finish the 18th. Salazar beamed like a lighthouse. "An honor, Mr. President." Then he trotted off toward the caddy shack. 20 minutes later, after returning a call from his chief of staff and downing a bottle of Coors, the president left the clubhouse and joined Salazar, who was sitting slouched in a golf cart on the 10th tee, the wide brim of his straw hat pulled low over his forehead. His hands hung loosely draped on the steering wheel and were now encased in a pair of leather work gloves. "Well, let's see if I can break 80, said the president, his eyes glistening in anticipation of a good game. Salazar said nothing and simply held out a driver. The president took the club and looked at it, puzzled. "This is a short hole. Don't you think a number 3 wood should do the job?" Staring at the ground, the hat hiding any facial expression, Salazar silently shook his head. "You know best," the president said agreeably. He approached the ball, flexed his hands on the club, arched into a backswing, and brought the head down gracefully, but entered into a rather awkward follow-through. The ball sailed straight over the fairway and landed a considerable distance beyond the green. A perplexed expression spread across the president's face as he retrieved his tee and climbed in the seat of the electric cart. "That's the first time I've ever seen you call the wrong club." The caddy did not reply. He pressed the battery pedal and steered the cart toward the 10th green. About halfway down the fairway, he reached over and placed a small package on the dashboard shelf directly in front of the President. "Bringing along a snack in case you get hungry?" asked the President good-naturedly. "No, sir, it's a bomb." The President's eyebrows pinched a fraction in irritation. "Not a funny joke, Reggie." His words suddenly choked off as the straw hat rose, and he found himself staring into the indigo blue eyes of a total stranger. Chapter 3. "Please keep your arms in their present position," said the stranger conversationally. "I am aware of the hand signal you were advised to give your Secret Service people if you thought your life was endangered." The President sat like a dead tree, disbelieving, more curious than afraid. He couldn't trust himself to speak at first, to assemble the right words. His eyes remained locked on the package. "A stupid act," he said finally. "You won't live to enjoy it. This is not an assassination. You will not be harmed if you follow my instructions. Do you accept that?" "You've got guts, mister." The stranger ignored the remark and kept talking in the tone of a schoolteacher reciting class rules of conduct. "The bomb is a fragmentation type that will shred any flesh and bone within 20 yards. If you attempt to alert your bodyguards, I will detonate it with an electronic control strapped to my wrist. Please continue your golf game as if nothing is out of the ordinary." He stopped the cart several feet from the ball, stepped to the grass, and glanced warily at the Secret Service agents, satisfying himself that they appeared more intent on scanning the woods around the course. Then he reached in the bag and pulled out a 6-iron. "It's obvious you don't know crap about golf," said the President.
When you're looking at stuff like that and you see it moving in those jumps like that, in the intervals with the streaks like that, if you notice up here where my crosshair's at, you see this little bar. We're doing 8-second exposure times right now. So it's opening the shutter for 8 seconds at a time and snapping off the video pic or the image, and then it's going on to the next one, and we're getting the 8 seconds. The longer exposures that we do, the more stuff we see in the background. But that's why the moving objects like that, you'll see them in streaks and they'll appear to jump like that. If we shorten down the exposure time, we won't see as much, but they'll move a lot more fluidly.
Pleased at gaining a small measure of control. "This calls for a chip shot. Hand me a 9-iron." The intruder obliged and stood by while the President chipped onto the green and putted into the cup. When they set off for the next tee, he studied the man seated beside him. The few strands of gray hair that strayed beneath the straw hat and the lines bordering the eyes revealed an age in the late 50s. The body was slender, almost frail, the hips slim. A good match for Reggie Salazar, except this man was a good 3 inches taller. The facial features were narrow and vaguely Scandinavian. The voice was educated. The cool manner and the squared shoulders suggested someone who was used to authority. Yet there was no hint of viciousness or evil. "I get the crazy impression," said the President calmly, "that you staged this intrusion to make a point." "Not so crazy. You're very astute."
Well, yeah, there's an advantage to it. I'll show you what the advantage is. I mean, if I just take this off and I do regular video, that's what we're going to see with regular video. Everything in this image right here is just regular video. It's we're running 30 frames per second or even faster, I think. But you're not really seeing much. You're seeing some of the city lights, you know, from the houses that are about a quarter mile from me across the field. You know, you're not really seeing it much. But if we turn that exposure time up and we do like a 4-second exposure. Hold on. Now we get some of the stars in the background. We can see this object right here is moving right over here. We could do, we're not getting as many stars, but we're still getting that object in there, and we're still getting some of the stars. So yeah, there's a big difference. So yeah, frames per second. The longer exposures that you do, the less frames per second it is, I think. Or no, I'm sorry. It's still doing the same frames per second no matter how long of exposure I'm doing. The frames per second change when I change resolution. Like right now I'm doing 1280 by 960 resolution. I think this is only 15 frames per second. If I use 640 by 480 with the binning, I think I could get 200 frames per second, something like that. It's 640 and 320 are giving me 200 frames per second. I think 800 by 600 is giving me around 60 frames per second, something like that. I haven't figured it all out, but I'm pretty sure that the resolutions have everything to do with the frames per second from everything that I'm reading in the user manual. Well, see, you already know a lot more than me, man, because I don't mess with the ISO type stuff. I don't have those types of cameras for like a Canon EOS. You know what I mean? Like I don't have stuff like that. You know, I gotta get one though because I want to do some super nice shots. We'll get some really nice shots with this once we put this same camera right here that we're using right now. Once we put that in the telescope, we'll get some amazing shots on the galaxies and nebula because we could do more than 4 seconds now. The camera that we've been using was limited to 4-second exposures, and it was only 720 by 480 resolution. Right now I'm pumping out, what was that? Uh, I'm pumping out 1280 by 960 right now. That's some really nice resolution. So once we get put this one in the actual telescope and use it in that way, and we start doing some imaging on the galaxies and nebulas, and we could do 15, 20, 30 seconds exposures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-minute exposures. We'll be able to get really nice detail, and it's going to come out a lot better than the 480p resolution that we were getting with the old camera.
But I would expect no less from a man with your power. Who the hell are you? For the sake of conversation, call me Joe, and I'll save you asking what this is all about as soon as we reach the T. There is a restroom there. He paused and removed a folder from inside his shirt, sliding it across the seat to the president. Enter and quickly scan the contents. Take no more than 8 minutes. Linger beyond that time, and you might arouse the suspicions of your bodyguards. I needn't describe the consequences. The electric cart slowly eased to a halt. Without a word, the president entered the restroom, sat down on the john, and began reading. Precisely 8 minutes later he came out, his face a mask of confusion. What kind of insane trick have you hatched? No trick. I don't understand why you went to such elaborate lengths to force me to read comic book science fiction. Not fiction. Then it has to be some sort of con job. The Jersey colony exists, said Joe patiently. Yes, and so does Atlantis. Joe smiled wryly. You've just been inducted into a very exclusive club. You're only the second president ever to be briefed on the project. Now I suggest you tee off, and I'll flesh out the picture as you continue playing around the course. It won't be a complete picture because there is too little time. Also, some details are not necessary for you to know. First, one question. You owe me that. All right. Reggie Salazar? Sleeping soundly in the caddy shack. God help you if you're lying. Which club? Joe asked blithely. A short hole. Give me a 4-iron. The President swung mechanically, but the ball flew straight and true, landing and rolling to within 10 feet of the cup. He tossed the club at Joe and sat heavily in the cart, waiting. Well then, Joe began as he accelerated toward the green. In 1963, only 2 months before his death, President Kennedy met with a group of 9 men at his home in Hyannisport, who proposed a highly secret leapfrog project to be developed behind the scenes of the fledgling man-in-space program. They were an inner core of brilliant young scientists, corporate businessmen, engineers, and politicians, who had achieved extraordinary success in their respective fields. Kennedy bought their idea and went so far as to launch a government agency that acted as a front to siphon federal tax money for what was to be codenamed Jersey Colony. The pot was also sweetened by the businessmen, who set up a fund to match the government dollar for dollar. Research facilities were created in existing buildings, usually old warehouses, scattered around the country. Millions were saved in startup costs, while eliminating questions by the curious over new construction of one vast development center. How was the operation kept secret? The President asked. Surely there were leaks. Joe shrugged. A simple technique. The research teams had their own pet projects. Each worked at a different location. The old act of one hand not knowing what the other was doing. The hardware was farmed out to small manufacturers. It was that elementary. The difficult part was coordinating the efforts under NASA's nose without letting their people know what was going on. So phony military officers were moved into the space centers at Cape Canaveral and Houston, also one at the Pentagon to backstop any embarrassing probes. Are you saying the Defense Department knows nothing of this? Joe smiled. The easiest part. One member of the inner core was a high-ranking staff officer, whose name is of no importance to you. He had no problem burying another military mission in the labyrinth of the Pentagon. Joe paused as they pulled up beside the ball. The President played another shot as if he were sleepwalking. He returned to the cart and stared at Joe. Doesn't seem possible NASA could be so completely hoodwinked. Again, one of the Space Administration's key directors belonged to the inner core. His vision was also that of a permanent base with limitless opportunity, instead of focusing on a few temporary manned landings on the lunar surface. But he realized NASA couldn't do 2 complicated and expensive programs at the same time, so he became a member of the Jersey Colony. The project was kept secret, so there would be no interference from the executive office, Congress, or the military. As things turned out, it was a wise decision. And the bottom line is that the United States has a solid foot on the moon. Joe nodded solemnly. Yes, Mr. President, that is correct. The President could not fully comprehend the enormity of the concept. Incredible that a project so vast could be carried off behind an impenetrable curtain of security, unknown and undiscovered for 26 years. Joe stared down the fairway. It would take me a month to describe the problems, the setbacks, and the tragedies that were suffered. The scientific and engineering breakthroughs in developing a hydrogen reduction process for making water, an oxygen extraction apparatus, and a power-generating plant whose turbine is driven by liquid nitrogen. The accumulation of materials and equipment launched into designated orbit by a private space agency sponsored by the inner core. The construction of a lunar transfer vehicle designed to ferry it all from Earth orbit to the Jersey Colony. And this was done under the nose of our entire space program? What was advertised as large communication satellites were disguised sections of the lunar transfer vehicle, each containing a man in an internal capsule. I won't go into the 10 years of planning for that moment, or the remarkable complexity of their link-up with each other and one of our abandoned space laboratories that was used as a base for the vehicle's assembly, or the breakthrough in designing a lightweight, efficient solar-electric engine using oxygen as the propulsion fuel. But the job was accomplished. Joe stopped to allow the president to hit another shot. Then it was a matter of gathering up the life support systems and supplies already sent into orbit and transporting all of it, actually towing it like a tugboat, to the predetermined site on the moon. Even an old Soviet orbiting laboratory and any useful piece of space junk were pulled to the Jersey colony. The beginning is a no-frills operation. Pioneering trek of man from his the most important evolutionary step since the first fish struggled onto land over 300 million years ago. But by God, we did it. As we sit here and talk, 10 men are living and working in a hostile environment 240,000 miles away. As Joe spoke, his eyes took on the look of a messiah. Then the vision faded, and he glanced at his watch. We'd better hurry along before the Secret Service wonders why we're lagging. Anyway, that's the gist of it. I'll try to answer your questions while you play. The president stared at him in awe. Jesus, he groaned, I don't think I can absorb all this. My apologies for throwing so much at you in so short a time, said Joe swiftly, but it was necessary. Where exactly on the moon is this Jersey colony? After studying the photographs from the lunar orbiter probes and Apollo missions, we detected a geyser of vapor issuing from a volcanic region in the southern hemisphere of the moon's far side. Closer examination showed it to be a large cavern, perfect shelter for locating the initial installation. You said 10 men are up there? Yes. What about rotation, replacements? No rotation. God, that means the original crew who assembled the lunar transport have been in space 6 years.
This book is continued on Disc 2. Disc 2.
God, that means the original crew who assembled the lunar transport have been in space 6 years. That's true, acknowledged Joe. 1 died and 7 were added as the base was expanded to support more life. What about their families? All bachelors. All knew and accepted the hardship and risk. You say I'm only the 2nd president to learn of the project? That's correct. Not allowing the nation's chief executive to share in the project is an insult to the office. Joe's dark blue eyes deepened even more. He stared at the president with stern malice. Presidents are political animals. Votes become more precious than treasure. Nixon might have used the Jersey colony as a smokescreen to bail himself out of Watergate. Same with Carter and the Iranian hostage fiasco. Reagan to enhance his image while lording it over the Russians. What's even more deplorable is the thought of what Congress would do with the project. The partisan politics that would come into play as debate raged to no good purpose over whether the money would be better spent on defense or feeding the poor. I love my country, Mr. President, and consider myself a better patriot than most, but I no longer have any faith in the government. You took the people's tax dollars, which will be repaid with interest from scientific benefits. But do not forget, private individuals and their corporations contributed half the money, and, I might add, without any thought of profit or personal gain. Defense and space contractors cannot make that claim. The President did not argue. He quietly set his ball on a tee and socked the ball towards the 18th green. If you distrust presidents so much, he said bitterly, why did you drop out of the heavens to tell me all this? We may have a problem. Joe slipped a photograph from the back of the folder and held it up. Through our connections, I've obtained a picture taken from an Air Force stealth aircraft making surveillance flights over Cuba. The President knew better than to ask how it came to be in Joe's hands. So what am I looking for? please study the area above the northern coast of the island and below the Florida Keys. The President took a pair of glasses from his shirt pocket and peered at the image in the photo. Looks like the Goodyear blimp. No, it's the Prospertier, an old airship belonging to Raymond LeBaron. I thought he was lost over the Caribbean 2 weeks ago. 10 days to be exact, along with the blimp and 2 crewmen. Then this photo was taken before he disappeared. No, the film came off the aircraft only 8 hours ago. Then LeBaron must be alive. I'd like to think so, but all attempts to raise the Prospertier by radio have gone unanswered. What's LeBaron's connection with the Jersey colony? He was a member of the Inner Corps. The President leaned close. And you, Joe? Are you one of the original 9 men who conceived the project? Joe didn't answer. He didn't have to. The President, staring at him, knew without a doubt. Satisfied, he sat back and relaxed. Okay, so what's your problem? In 10 days, the Soviets will take their newest heavy-lift launch vehicle out of the barn and send it into space, with a manned lunar lander that's 6 times the size and weight of the module used by our astronauts during the Apollo program. You know the details from CIA intelligence reports. I've been briefed on their lunar mission, the President agreed. And you're also aware that over the past 2 years they've sent 3 unmanned probes in orbit around the moon to survey and photograph landing sites. The third and last crashed onto the moon's surface. The second had an engine malfunction and its fuel exploded. The first probe, however, performed successfully, at least in the beginning. It circled the moon 12 times. Then something went wrong. After returning to Earth orbit prior to re-entry, it suddenly refused all commands from the ground. For the next 18 months, Soviet space controllers worked at bringing the craft down intact. Whether or not they were able to retrieve its visual data, we have no way of knowing. Finally, they managed to fire the retro rockets. But instead of Siberia, their lunar probe, Selenos 4, landed in the Caribbean Sea. What has this to do with...
Well, I could enhance certain things for you. Let me see if I like if I wanted to look at this little deal. Oh wait.
Baron. He went searching for the Soviet moon probe. A doubtful look crossed the President's face. According to CIA reports, the Russians retrieved the craft in deep water off Cuba. A smokescreen. They even put on a good show of raising the craft, but in reality they were never able to find it. And your people think they know where it lies? We have a site pinpointed, yes. Why would you want to beat the Russians out of a few pictures of the moon? There are thousands of photos available to anybody who wants to study them. Those were all taken before Jersey Colony was established. The new Russian survey will no doubt reveal the location. What harm could it do? I believe that if the Kremlin discovers the truth, the USSR's first mission to the moon will be to attack, capture our colony, and use it for their own purposes. I don't buy that. The Kremlin would be laying their entire space program open for retaliation by our side. You forget, Mr. President, our lunar project is blanketed in secrecy. No one can charge the Russians with stealing something that isn't supposed to exist. You're stabbing in the dark, the President said sharply. Joe's eyes hardened. No matter. Our astronauts were the first to step on the lunar surface. We were the first to colonize it. The moon belongs to the United States, and we shall fight any intrusion." "This isn't the 14th century," said the President, shocked. "We can't take up arms and keep the Soviets or anyone else off the moon. Besides, the United Nations ruled that no country had jurisdiction over the moon and planets." "Would the Kremlin heed UN policy if they were in our shoes? I think not." Joe twisted in the seat and extracted a putter from the bag. "The 18th green. Your final play, Mr. President." Dazedly, the President lined up the lay of the green and sank a 20-foot putt. "I could stop you," he said coldly. "How?" "NASA has no ready hardware to land a platoon of Marines on the lunar surface. Thanks to the short-sightedness of you and your predecessors, their efforts are wrapped up in the orbiting space station. I can't stand by and allow you to start a war in space that might spill over on Earth." "Your hands are tied." "You could be wrong about the Russians." "Let us hope so," said Joe. "But I suspect they may have already killed Raymond LeBaron." "And this is why you've taken me into your confidence?" "If the worst happens, at least you have been alerted to the facts and can prepare your strategy for the bedlam to follow. Suppose I have my bodyguards arrest you as a crackpot assassin, and then blow the lid off Jersey Colony." "Arrest me and Reggie Salazar dies. Expose the project and all the behind-the-scenes double-dealing, the backstabbing, the fraud and the lies, and yes, the death that took place to accomplish what has been achieved, will be laid on your political doorstep, beginning when you were sworn into the Senate. You'll get bounced out of the White House under a bigger cloud than Nixon, providing, of course, you live that long." "You're threatening me with blackmail?" So far the President had kept his anger under control, but now he was seething with fury. Salazar's life would be a small price to pay to preserve the integrity of the presidency. 2 weeks. Then you can announce the existence of the Jersey Colony to the world. With trumpets sounding and drums beating, you can play the big political hero. 2 weeks, and you can demonstrate proof of this century's greatest scientific achievement. After all this time, why then? Because that's when we've scheduled the original crew to leave Jersey Colony and return to Earth with the accumulation of 2 decades of space research. Reports on meteorological and lunar probes, the scientific results on thousands of biological, chemical, and atmospheric experiments, uncountable photographs and miles of video records of the first human establishment of a planetary civilization. The first phase of the project is completed. The dream of the inner core is finished. Jersey Colony now belongs to the American people. The President toyed with his putter thoughtfully. Then he asked, "Who are you?" "Look to your memory. We knew each other many years ago." "How am I to contact you?" "I'll arrange another meeting when I feel it's required." Joe lifted the clubs from the cart's rack and began walking along a narrow path toward the clubhouse. Then he stopped and came back. "By the way, I lied. That's not a bomb, but a present from the inner core. A new box of golf balls." The President gazed at him in frustration. "Burn in hell, Joe." "Oh, and one more thing. Congratulations." "Congratulations?" Joe handed him the scorecard. "I kept track of your play. You hit a 79. Chapter 4. The sleek hull of the sailboard skimmed the choppy water with the graceful elegance of an arrow shot through mist. Its slick and delicately curved shape was as visually pleasing to the eye as it was efficient in achieving great speed over the waves. Perhaps the simplest of all sailing systems, the board was built with a polyethylene shell molded over an inner core of rigid plastic foam to give it lightness and flexibility. A small skeg or fin protruded from below the stern for lateral control, while a dagger board hung down near the middle to prevent the board from being swept sideways by the wind. A triangular sail, dyed purple with a broad turquoise stripe, clung to an aluminum mast that was mounted onto the board by a universal joint. An oval tubular wishbone or boom circled the mast and sail, and was tightly gripped by long, slender hands that were coarse-skinned and calloused. Dirk Pitt was tired, more tired than his dulled mind could accept. The muscles of his arms and legs felt as though they were sheathed in lead, and the ache in his back and shoulders grew more intense with each maneuver of the sailboard. For at least the third time in the last hour, he fought off a growing urge to head for the nearest beach and stretch out in the sand. Through the clear window of the sail he studied the orange buoy marking the final windward leg of the 30-mile board-sailing marathon race around Biscayne Bay to the Cape Florida lighthouse on Key Biscayne. Carefully, he chose his position to arc around the buoy. Deciding on a jibe, the most graceful maneuver in windsurfing, he threaded his way through the heavy traffic, weighted down the stern of his board, and aimed the bow on a new course. Then, gripping the mast with one hand, he swung the rigging to windward, shifted his feet, and released the boom with his other hand. Next he pulled the fluttering sail against the wind and caught the boom at the precise moment. Propelled by a fresh 20-knot breeze from the north, the sailboard sped through the choppy sea and soon gained a speed of nearly 30 miles an hour. Pitt was mildly surprised to see that out of a field of 41 racers, most of them at least 15 years younger, he was in third place, only 20 yards behind the leaders. The multicolored sails from the fleet of windsurfers flashed across the blue-green water like a prism gone mad. The finish at the lighthouse was in sight now. Pitt closely watched the board sailor ahead of him, waiting for the right moment to attack. But before he attempted to pass, his opponent miscalculated a wave and fell. Now Pitt was second, with only half a mile to go. Then, ominously, a dark shadow in a cloudless sky passed overhead, and he heard the exhaust of propeller-driven aircraft engines above and slightly to his left. He stared upward, and his eyes widened in disbelief. No more than 100 yards away, shielding the sun like an eclipse, a blimp was descending from the sky, her great bow set on a collision course with the sailboard fleet. She appeared to be drifting out of control. Her two engines were barely turning over at idle speed, but she was swept through the air by the strong breeze. The sailboarders watched helplessly as the giant intruder crossed their path. The gondola struck the crest of a wave, and the blimp bounced back into the air, leveling off 5 feet above the water in front of the lead board sailor. Unable to turn in time, the young boy, no more than 17, dove from his board an instant before his mast and sail were minced to shreds under the blimp's starboard propeller. Pitt nimbly carved a sharp tack and swung on a parallel course under the rampaging airship. From the corner of his eye he noted the name, Prospertier, in huge red letters on her side. The gondola door was open, but he couldn't make out any movement inside. He shouted, but his voice was lost in the exhaust of the engines and rush of the wind. The ungainly craft skidded across the sea as though it had a mind of its own. Suddenly Pitt felt the prickle of disaster in the small of his back. The Prospertier was moving toward the beach, only a quarter-mile away, and headed directly at the broad terraced side of the Sonesta Beach Hotel. Though the impact of a lighter-than-air ship against a solid structure would cause little damage, there was the ugly certainty of fire from ruptured fuel tanks spilling into the rooms of dozing guests or falling onto the diners on the patio below. Ignoring the numbing drain of exhaustion, Pitt angled his sailboard on a course that would cross under the great rounded nose. The gondola danced into another swell, and a spinning propeller whipped a cloud of salt spray into his eyes. His vision blurred momentarily, and he came within inches of losing his balance. He settled in a squatting stance and steadied his tiny craft as he narrowed the distance. Crowds of sunbathers gestured excitedly at the strange sight rapidly approaching the hotel's sloping beach. Pitt's timing would have to be near perfect. There would be no second attempt. If he missed, there was every chance his body would end up in pieces behind the propellers. He was beginning to feel light-headed. His strength was nearly sapped. He sensed that his muscles were taking longer to respond to the demands of his brain. He braced himself as his sailboard streaked under the blimp's nose. Then he leapt. His hands grasped one of the Prospertier's bow ropes, but slipped on the wet surface, scraping the skin from his fingers and palms. Desperately, he swung a leg around the line and held on with every scrap of energy he had left. His weight pulled down the bow, and he was dragged under the surface. He clawed up the rope until his head broke free. Then he was gulping air and spitting out seawater. The pursuer had become the captive. The drag from Pitt's body wasn't nearly enough to stop the air monster, much less slow its momentum from the wind. He was about to release his precarious hold when his feet touched bottom. The blimp carried him through the surge of the surf, and he felt like he was riding a roller coaster. Then he was hurtled onto the warm sands of the beach. He looked up and saw the low seawall of the hotel looming a scant 100 feet away. My God, he thought, this is it. In a few seconds the Prospertier would crash into the hotel and possibly explode. And there was something else. The whirling propellers would shatter on impact, their metal fragments spraying the awestruck crowds with a force as deadly as shrapnel. "For God's sake, help me!" Pitt shouted. The mass of people on the beach stood frozen, their mouths gaping, held stupefied in childlike fascination by the strange spectacle. Suddenly, 2 teenage girls and a boy sprang forward and grabbed one of the other tow ropes. Next came a lifeguard, followed by an elderly, heavy-set woman. Then the dam broke, and 20 onlookers surged forward and gathered in the trailing lines. It was as though a tribe of half-naked natives had challenged a maddened brontosaurus to a tug-of-war. Bare feet dug into the sand, plowing furrows as the stubborn mass above their heads tugged them across the beach. The drag on the bow lines caused the hull to pivot, and the huge finned tail swung around in a 180-degree arc until it was pointing at the hotel, the wheel on the bottom of the gondola scraping through the bushes growing from the top of the seawall, the propellers missing the concrete by inches and chopping through the branches and leaves. A strong gust of wind blew in from the sea, shoving the Prospertier over the patio, smashing umbrellas and tables, driving her stern toward the 5th story of the hotel. Lines were torn from hands, and a wave of helplessness swept over the beach. The battle seemed lost. Pitt struggled to his feet and half ran, half staggered to a nearby palm tree. In a final desperate act, he coiled his line around the slender trunk, feverishly praying it wouldn't snap from the strain. The line took up the slack and stretched taut. The 50-foot palm shuddered, swayed, and bent for several seconds. The crowd collectively held its breath. Then, with agonizing slowness, the tree gradually straightened into its former upright position. The shallow roots held firm, and the blimp stopped, its fins less than 6 feet from the east wall of the hotel. 200 people gave out a rousing cheer and began applauding. The women jumped up and down and laughed, while the men roared and thrust out their hands in the thumbs-up position. No winning team ever received a more spontaneous ovation. The hotel security guards materialized and kept stray onlookers away from the still-turning propellers. Sand coated Pitt's wet body as he stood there catching his breath, becoming conscious of the pain from his rope-burned hands. Staring up at the Prospertier, he had his first solid look at the airship and was fascinated by the antiquated design. It was obvious she predated the modern Goodyear blimps. He made his way around the scattered tables and chairs on the patio and climbed into the gondola. The crew were still strapped in their seats, unmoving, unspeaking. Pitt leaned over the pilot, found the ignition switches, and turned them off. The engines popped softly once or twice and went silent as their propellers gave a final twitch and came to rest. The quiet was tomb-like. Pitt grimaced and scanned the interior of the gondola. There was no sign of damage. The instruments and controls appeared to be in operating order. But it was the extensive electronics that amazed him. Gradiometers for detecting iron, side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profiler to sweep the sea floor. Everything for an underwater search expedition. He wasn't aware of the sea of faces peering up into the open door of the gondola, nor did he hear the pulsating scream of approaching sirens. He felt detached and momentarily disoriented. The hot, humid atmosphere was heavy with a morbid eeriness and the sickening stench of human decay. One of the crewmen was slouched over a small table, head resting on arms as if he were asleep. His clothes were damp and stained. Pitt placed his hand on a shoulder and gave a slight shake. There was no firmness to the flesh. It felt soft and pulpy. An icy shroud fell over him that lifted goosebumps on every inch of his skin. Yet the sweat was trickling down his body in streams. He turned his attention to the ghastly apparitions seated at the controls. Their faces were covered by a blanket of flies, and decomposition was eating away all traces of life. The skin was slipping from the flesh like broken blisters on burns. Jaws hung slack with mouths agape, the lips and tongues swollen and parched. Eyes were open and staring into nothingness, eyeballs opaque and clouded over. Hands still hung on the controls, their fingernails turned blue. Unchecked by enzymes, bacteria had formed gases that grotesquely bloated the stomachs. The damp air and the high temperatures of the tropics were greatly speeding the process of putrefaction. The rotting corpses inside the Prospertier had flown from some unknown grave, a macabre crew in a charnel airship on a ghostly mission. Chapter 5. The naked corpse of an adult black woman lay stretched on an examining table under the glaring lights of the autopsy room. Preservation was excellent, no visible injuries due to violence. To the trained eye, the state of rigor mortis indicated she had been dead less than 7 hours. Her age appeared to be somewhere between 25 and 30. The body might have drawn male stares once, but now it lay undernourished, wasted, and ravaged by a decade of drug intake. The Dade County coroner, Dr. Calvin Rooney, wasn't too pleased about doing the autopsy. There were enough deaths in Miami to keep his staff working around the clock, and he preferred to spend his time on the more dramatic and puzzling post-mortem examinations. A garden-variety drug overdose held little interest for him. But this one was found dumped on a county commissioner's front lawn, and it wouldn't do to send in a third-string quarterback. Wearing a blue lab coat because he detested the standard white issue, Rooney, a homegrown Floridian, U.S. Army veteran, and Harvard Medical School graduate, slipped a new cassette in a portable tape recorder and dryly commented on the general condition of the body. He picked up a scalpel and bent over for the dissection, starting a few inches under the chin and slicing downward toward the pubic bone. Suddenly, Rooney halted the incision over the chest cavity and leaned closer, squinting through a pair of wide-lensed, horn-rimmed glasses. In the next 15 minutes, he removed and examined the heart while delivering a running monologue into the tape recorder. Rooney was in the midst of making a last-minute observation when Sheriff Tyler Sweat entered the autopsy room. He was a medium-built, brooding man, slightly round-shouldered, his face a blend of melancholy and brutish determination. Methodical and shrewdly earnest, he enjoyed great respect from the men and women under him. He threw an expressionless glance at the opened cadaver, and then nodded a greeting to Rooney. "New piece of meat?" "The woman from the commissioner's yard," answered Rooney. "Another O.D.?" "No such luck. More work for homicide. She was murdered. I found 3 punctures in the heart." "Nice pick." "From all indications." Sweat peered at the balding little chief medical examiner, whose benign appearance seemed better suited to a parish priest. "They can't fool you, Doc." "What brings the master scourge of evildoers to the forensic palace?" Rooney asked amiably. "You slumming?" "No, an identification by VIPs. I'd like you in on it." "The body's from the blimp," Rooney deduced. Sweat nodded. "Mrs. LeBaron is here to view the remains." "I don't recommend it. What's left of her husband isn't a pretty sight to someone who doesn't see death every day." "I tried to tell her that identification of his effects would satisfy legal requirements, but she persisted.
Even brought along an aide from the governor's office to grease the way. Where are they? Waiting in the morgue office. News media? An entire regiment of TV and press reporters running around like crazy people. I've ordered my deputies to keep them confined to the lobby. Strange how the world works, said Rooney in one of his philosophical moods. The renowned Raymond LeBaron gets front-page headlines, while this poor baggage gets a column inch next to classified advertising. Then he sighed, removed his lab coat, and threw it over a chair. Let's get it over with. I've got 2 more post-mortems to conduct this afternoon. As he spoke, a tropical storm passed over, and the sound of thunder rumbled through the walls. Rooney slipped on a sports jacket and straightened his tie. They fell into step, Sweat staring down pensively at the design in the hallway carpet. "Any idea on the cause of LeBaron's death?" asked the sheriff. "Too soon to tell. The lab results were inconclusive. I want to run some more tests. Too many things don't add up. I don't mind admitting this one is a puzzler." "No guesses?" "Nothing I'd put on paper. Problem is the incredibly rapid rate of decomposition. I've seldom seen tissue disintegrate so fast, except maybe once back in 1974. Before Sweat could prod Rooney's recollection, they reached the morgue office and entered. The governor's aide, a slippery type in a 3-piece suit, jumped up. Even before he opened his mouth, Rooney classified him as a jerk. "Can we please get the show on the road, Sheriff? Mrs. LeBaron is most uncomfortable and would like to return to her hotel as soon as possible." "I sympathize with her," the sheriff drawled, "but I shouldn't have to remind a public servant that there are certain laws we must follow. And I needn't remind you the governor expects your department to extend every courtesy to ease her grief." Rooney marveled at Sweat's stony patience. The sheriff simply brushed by the aide as though he were walking past trash on a sidewalk. "This is our chief medical examiner, Dr. Rooney. He will assist with the identification." Jessie LeBaron didn't look the least bit uncomfortable. She sat in an orange plastic contour chair, poised, cool, head held high. And yet Rooney sensed a fragility that was held together by discipline and nerve. He was an old hand at presiding over corpse identification by relatives. He'd suffered through the ordeal hundreds of times in his career, and instinctively spoke softly and in a gentle manner. "Mrs. LeBaron, I understand what you're going through, and will make this as painless as possible. But first I wish to make it clear that by simply identifying the effects found on the bodies, you will satisfy the laws set down by the state and county. Second, any physical characteristics you can recall, such as scars, dental work, bone fractures, or surgical incisions, will be of great help in my own identification. And third, I respectfully beg you not to view the remains. Though facial features are still recognizable, decomposition has done its work. I think you'd be happier remembering Mr. LeBaron as he was in life, rather than how he looks in a morgue." "Thank you, Dr. Rooney," said Jessie. "I'm grateful for your concern. But I must be certain my husband is truly dead." Rooney nodded miserably, and then gestured at a work table containing several pieces of clothing, wallets, wristwatches, and other personal articles. "You've identified Mr. LeBaron's effects?" "Yes, I have sorted through them." "And you're satisfied they belonged to him?" "There can be no doubt about the wallet and its contents. The watch was a gift from me on our first anniversary." Rooney walked over and held it up. "A gold Cartier with matching band and Roman numerals marked in. Am I correct in saying they're diamonds?" "Yes, a rare form of black diamond. It was his birthstone." "April, I believe." She merely nodded. "Besides your husband's personal articles, Mrs. LeBaron, do you recognize anything belonging to Buck Caesar or Joseph Cavilla?" "I don't recall the jewelry they wore, but I'm certain the other clothing items are what Buck and Joe were wearing when I last saw them." "Our investigators can find no next of kin of Caesar and Cavilla," said Sweat. "It would be most helpful if you can point out which articles of clothing belonged to whom." For the first time Jessie LeBaron faltered. "I'm not sure. I think the denim shorts and flowered shirt are Buck's. The other things probably belonged to Jokavila. She paused. May we view my husband's body now? I can't change your mind? Rooney asked in a sympathetic voice. No, I must insist. You'd best do what Mrs. LeBaron asks, said the governor's aide, who had yet to introduce himself. Rooney looked at Swett and shrugged in resignation. If you will please follow me. The remains are kept in the refrigeration room. Obediently, everyone trailed him to a thick door with a small window set at eye level, and stood in silence as he yanked on a heavy latch. Cold air spilled over the threshold, and Jessie involuntarily shivered as Rooney motioned them inside. A morgue attendant appeared and led the way to one of the square doors along the wall. He swung it open, pulled out a sliding stainless steel table, and stood aside. Rooney took one corner of the sheet covering the corpse and hesitated. This was the only part of his job he hated. The reaction to viewing the dead usually fell into 4 categories: those who vomited, those who passed out cold, those who broke into hysterics. But it was the last type that intrigued Rooney. The ones who stood as if turned to stone and showed no emotion at all. He would have given a month's salary to know the thoughts circulating through their minds. He lifted the sheet. The governor's aide took one look, made a pathetic groaning sound, and passed out into the arms of the sheriff. The grisly work of decay was revealed in all its horror. Rooney was astonished by Jessie's response. She stared long and hard at the grotesque thing that lay rotting on the table. She sucked in her breath, and her whole body went taut. Then she raised her eyes, not blinking, and spoke in a calm, controlled voice. "That is not my husband." "Are you positive?" Rooney asked softly. "Look for yourself," she said in a flat monotone. "The hairline is wrong. So is the bone structure. Raymond had an angular face. This one is more round." "Decomposition of the flesh distorts facial features," Rooney explained. "Please study the teeth." Rooney looked down. "What about them?" "They have silver fillings." "I don't follow." "My husband's fillings were gold." There was no arguing with her on that score, thought Rooney. A man of Raymond LeBaron's wealth wouldn't have settled for cheap dental work. "But the watch, the clothing, you identified them as his." "I don't give a damn what I said," she cried. "This loathsome thing is not Raymond LeBaron." Rooney was stunned at her fury. He stood dazed and unable to speak as she stormed from the icy room. The sheriff handed the limp aide to the morgue attendant and turned to the coroner. "What in hell do you make of that?" Rooney shook his head. "I don't know. My guess is she went into shock. Probably fell over the edge and began raving. You know better than I, most people can't accept the death of a loved one. She closed her mind and refused to accept the truth." "She wasn't raving." Swett looked at him. "What do you call it?" "Shrewd acting." "How did you pick that out of the air?" "The wristwatch," answered Rooney. "One of my staff worked nights as a jeweler to put himself through medical school. He spotted it right off. The expensive Cartier watch Mrs. LeBaron gave her husband on their anniversary is a fake. One of those inexpensive reproductions that are illegally manufactured in Taiwan or Mexico. Why would a woman who could write a check for $1 million give her husband a cheap imitation?" Raymond LeBaron was no slouch when it came to style and taste. He must have recognized it for what it was. Better to ask the question, why did he stoop to wearing it? "So you think she put on an act and lied about the body ID?" "My gut reaction is that she prepared herself for what to expect," Rooney replied. "And I'd go so far as to bet my new Mercedes-Benz that genetic tracing, the dental report, and the results of the rubber casts I made from what remained of the fingerprints and sent to the FBI lab will prove she was right." He turned and peered at the corpse. "That isn't Raymond LeBaron lying there on the slab." Chapter 6. Detective Lieutenant Harry Victor, a lead investigator for the Metro-Dade County Police Department, sat back in a swivel chair and studied several photographs taken inside the Prospertier's control cabin. After several minutes, he raised a pair of rimless glasses over a forehead that slipped under a blond hairpiece and rubbed his eyes. Victor was a tidy man, everything in its correct pigeonhole, neatly alphabetized and consecutively numbered. The only cop in the memory of the department who actually enjoyed making out reports. When most men watched sports on television on weekends or relaxed around a resort swimming pool on vacations, reading Rex Burns' detective novels, Victor reviewed files on unsolved cases. A diehard, he was more fanatical about tying up loose ends than obtaining a conviction. The Prospertier case was unlike any he'd faced in his 18 years on the force. 3 dead men falling out of the sky in an antique blimp didn't exactly lend itself to routine police investigation. Leads were non-existent. The 3 bodies in the morgue revealed no clues to where they had been hiding for a week and a half. He lowered his glasses and was attacking the photographs again when the desk phone buzzed. He lifted the receiver and said pensively, "Yes?" "You have a witness to see you about a statement," answered the receptionist. "Send him on back," said Victor. He closed the file containing the photographs and laid it on the metal desk, whose surface was antiseptic except for a small sign with his name and the telephone. He held the receiver to his ear as though receiving a call and swiveled sideways, looking across the spacious homicide office, keeping his eyes focused at an angle toward the door leading to the corridor. A uniformed receptionist appeared at the threshold and pointed in Victor's direction. A tall man nodded, eased past her, and approached. Victor gestured to a chair opposite the desk and began muttering in a one-way conversation with the dial tone. It was an old interrogation ploy that gave him an uninterrupted minute to inspect a witness or suspect and mentally construct a profile. Most important, it was an opportunity to observe habits and odd mannerisms that could be used for leverage later. The male seated across from Victor was about 37 or 38. Approximately 6'3", weight 185, give or take 5 pounds, black hair tending to be a bit wavy, with no indication of gray. Skin darkened from year-round exposure to the sun. Eyebrows dark and slightly bushy. Straight, narrow nose, lips firm with corners turned up in a slight but fixed grin. Wearing light blue sports coat and off-white slacks. Pale yellow polo shirt with collar open. Good taste, casual but not ultra-expensive, probably purchased at Saks rather than a plush men's store. Non-smoker, as there was no evidence of cigarette package bulge in coat or shirt. Arms were folded, suggesting calm and indifference, and the hands were narrow, long and weathered. No rings or other jewelry, only an old orange-faced diver's watch with a heavy stainless steel band. This one didn't follow the general pattern. The others who had sat in that chair turned fidgety after a while. Some masked nervousness with arrogance. Most restlessly stared around the office, through the windows, at pictures on the walls, at the other officers working their cases, changing position, crossing and recrossing their legs. For the first time Victor could recall, he felt uncomfortable and at a disadvantage. His routine was sidetracked, his act rapidly washing out. The visitor wasn't the least bit ruffled. He stared at Victor with bemused interest through opaline green eyes that possessed a mesmeric quality. They seemed to pass right through the detective, and finding nothing of interest, examined the paint on the wall behind. Then they dropped to the telephone. "Most police departments use the Horizon communication system," he said in an even tone. "If you wish to speak to someone on the other end, I suggest you push a button for an open line." Victor looked down. One of his 4 buttons was lit but not punched. "You're very astute, Mr. Pitt, Dirk Pitt. If you're Lieutenant Victor, we had an appointment." "I'm Victor." He paused to replace the receiver in its cradle. You were the first person inside the control car of the Prospertier blimp? That's right. Thank you for coming in, especially so early on a Sunday. I'd appreciate your cooperation in clearing up a few questions. Not at all. Will it take long? 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. Do you have to be somewhere? I'm booked on a plane for Washington in 2 hours. Victor nodded. I'll get you on your way in plenty of time. He pulled open a drawer and took out a portable tape recorder. Let's go somewhere more private. He led Pitt down a long hallway to a small interview room. The interior was Spartan, only a desk, 2 chairs, and an ashtray. Victor sat down and fed a new cassette into the recorder. Mind if I put our conversation on tape? I'm a terrible note-taker. None of the secretaries can decipher my handwriting. Pitt shrugged agreeably. Victor moved the machine to the center of the desk and pressed the red record button. Your name? Dirk Pitt. Middle initial? E for Eric. Address? 266 Airport Place, Washington, D.C. 20001. Telephone where you can be reached? Pitt gave Victor the phone number of his office. Occupation? Special Projects Director for the National Underwater and Marine Agency. Can you describe the event you witnessed on the afternoon of Saturday, October 20th? Pitt told Victor of his sighting the out-of-control blimp during the sailboard marathon race, the mad ride while clinging to the mooring line, and the last-second capture only a few feet away from potential disaster, ending with his entry into the gondola. Did you touch anything? Only the ignition and battery switches. And I laid my hand on the shoulder of the corpse seated at the navigator's table. Nothing else? The only other place I might have left a fingerprint was on the boarding ladder. And the backrest of the co-pilot's seat, said Victor with a smug smile. No doubt when you leaned over and turned off the switches. Fast work. Next time I'll wear surgical gloves. The FBI was most cooperative. I admire competence. Did you take anything? Pitt shot Victor a sharp look. No. Could anyone else have entered and removed any objects? Pitt shook his head. After I left, the hotel security guards sealed off the gondola. The next person inside was a uniformed police officer. Then what did you do? I paid one of the hotel lifeguards to swim out and retrieve my sailboard. He owned a small pickup truck and was kind enough to run me back to the house where I was staying with friends. In Miami? Coral Gables. Mind if I ask what you were doing in town? I wound up an offshore exploration project for Numa and decided to take a week's vacation. Did you recognize any of the bodies? Not damned likely. I couldn't identify my own father in that condition. Any idea who they might be? I assume one of them was Raymond LeBaron. You're familiar with the disappearance of the Prospertier? The news media covered the disappearance in great depth. Only a backwoods recluse could have missed it. Any pet theories on where the blimp and its crew were buried for 10 days? I haven't a clue. Not even a wild idea, Victor persisted. Could be a colossal publicity stunt, a media campaign to promote LeBaron's publishing empire. Interest grew in Victor's eyes. Go on. Or maybe an ingenious scheme to manipulate LeBaron conglomerate stock prices. Sell large blocks before he disappears and buy when prices tumble afterward, and sell again when they rise during his resurrection. How do you explain their deaths? The plot backfired. Why? Ask your coroner. I'm asking you. They probably ate tainted fish on whatever deserted island they hung out on, said Pitt, tiring of the game. How would I know? If you want a scenario, hire a screenwriter. The interest in Victor's eyes blinked out. He relaxed in his chair and sighed dejectedly. I thought for a second you might have something, a gimmick that could get me and the department off the hook. But your theory went down the drain like all the others. I'm not surprised, said Pitt with an indifferent grin. How were you able to switch off the power within seconds of entering the control car? Victor asked, bringing the interrogation back on track. After piloting 20 different aircraft during service in the Air Force and civilian life, I knew where to look. Victor appeared satisfied. One more question, Mr. Pitt. When you first spotted the blimp, from what direction?
That was pretty damn awesome. Did you guys see that? That thing came in just bobbing and weaving, doing all kinds of stuff. That was awesome.
Was she flying? She was drifting with the wind out of the northeast. Victor reached over and turned off the recorder. That should do it. Can I reach you at your office number during the day? If I'm not there, my secretary can track me down. Thank you for your help. Nothing substantial, I'm afraid, said Pitt. We have to pull on every thread. Lots of pressure with LeBaron being the big shot that he was. This has to be the weirdest case the department's ever encountered. I don't envy you finding a solution. Pitt glanced at his watch and rose from his chair. I'd better get a move on for the airport. Victor stood and reached across the desk to shake hands. If you should dream up another plot line, Mr. Pitt, please give me a call. I'm always interested in a good fantasy. Pitt paused in the doorway and turned, a fox-like expression on his face. You want a lead, Lieutenant? Run this one up the flagpole. Airships need helium for their lift. An old antique like the Prospertier must have required a couple 100,000 cubic feet of gas to get her in the air. After a week, enough would have leaked out to keep her grounded. Do you follow? Depends on where you're heading. There is no way the blimp could have materialized off Miami unless an experienced crew with the necessary supplies re-inflated the hull 48 hours before. Victor had the look of a man about to be baptized. What are you suggesting? That you look for a friendly neighborhood service station that can pump 200,000 cubic feet of helium. Then Pitt turned into the hallway and was gone. Chapter 7. I hate boats, Rooney grumbled. I can't swim, can't float, and get seasick looking through the window of a washing machine. Sheriff Sweat handed him a double martini. Here, this will cure your hang-ups. Rooney ruefully eyed the waters of the bay and drained half his drink. You're not going out in the ocean, I hope? No, just a leisurely cruise around the bay. Sweat ducked into the forward cabin of his gleaming white fishing boat and turned over the engine. The single 260-horsepower turbocharged diesel knocked into life. Exhaust rumbled from the stern, and the deck throbbed beneath their feet. Then Sweat cast off the lines and eased the boat away from the dock, threading through a maze of moored yachts to Biscayne Bay. By the time the bow skipped past the Channel boys, Rooney was looking for a second drink. Where do you keep the Courage? Down in the forward cabin. Help yourself. There's ice in the brass diver's helmet. When Rooney resurfaced, he asked, What's this all about, Tyler? This is Sunday. You didn't drag me away from my season box in the middle of a good football game to show me Miami Beach from the water. Truth is, I heard you finished your report on the bodies from the blimp last night. 3 o'clock this morning, to be exact. I thought you might want to tell me something. For God's sake, Tyler, what's so damned earth-shaking that you couldn't have waited until tomorrow morning? About an hour ago, I got a call from some Fed in Washington. Sweat paused to ease the throttle up a notch. Said he was with a domestic intelligence agency I'd never heard of. I won't bore you with his downright belligerent talk. Never can understand why everybody up north thinks they can blindside a southern boy. The upshot was he demanded we turn over the dead from the blimp to federal authorities. Which federal authorities? Refused to name them. Got vague as hell when I pushed. Rooney was suddenly intensely interested. He give any hint why they wanted the bodies? Claimed it was a security matter. You told him no, of course. I told him I'd think about it. The turn of events and the gin combined to make Rooney forget his fear of water. He began to notice the trim lines of the fiberglass craft. It was Sheriff Sweat's second office, occasionally pressed into service as a backup police cruiser. but more often used to entertain county and state officials on weekend fishing trips. "What do you call her?" Rooney asked. "Call who?" "The boat." "Oh, the Southern Comfort. She's a 35-footer, cruises at 15 knots, built in Australia by an outfit called Stebercraft." "To get back to the LeBaron case," Rooney said, sipping at his martini. "Are you going to give in?" "I'm tempted," said Sweat, smiling. "Homicide has yet to turn up lead one. The news media are making a circus out of it. Everybody from the governor on down is pressuring my ass. And to top it off, there's every likelihood the crime wasn't committed in my jurisdiction. Hell yes, I'm tempted to pass the buck to Washington. Only I'm just stubborn enough to think we might pull a solution out of this mess." "All right, what do you want from me?" The sheriff turned from the helm and looked at him steadily. "I want you to tell me what's in your report." My findings made the puzzle worse. A small sailboat with 4 teenagers slipped across their bow, and Sweat slowed down and gave way. "Tell me about it." "Let's start at the end and work backwards. Okay with you?" "Go ahead." "Threw the hell out of me at first, mostly because I wasn't looking for it. I had a similar case 15 years ago. A female body was discovered sitting in a patio chair in her backyard. Her husband claimed they'd been drinking the night before, and he'd gone to bed alone, thinking she would follow. When he awoke in the morning and looked around, he found her right where he left her, sitting on the patio, only now she was dead. She had all the appearances of a natural death. No marks of violence, no sign of poison, just a generous amount of alcohol. The organs seemed healthy enough. There were no indications of previous disease or disorder. For a woman of 40, she had the body of a 25-year-old. It bugged the hell out of me. Then the pieces began to come together. The post-mortem lividity, that's the discoloration of the skin caused by the sinking of blood due to gravity, is usually purplish. Her lividity was cherry pink, which pointed to death from either cyanide or carbon monoxide poisoning or hypothermia. I also discovered hemorrhaging of the pancreas. Through a process of elimination, the first 2 were discarded. The final nail in the coffin was the husband's occupation. The evidence wasn't exactly hardcore, but it was enough for the judge to put him away for 50 years. "What was the husband's line of work?" asked Sweat. "He drove a truck for a frozen food company. A neat plan. He pumped booze in her until she passed out, set her inside his truck, which he always took home nights and weekends, turned up the refrigeration unit, and waited for her to harden. After the poor woman expired, he put her back in the patio chair and went to bed." Sweat stared blankly. "You're not saying the corpses found in the blimp froze to death?" "I'm saying exactly that." "No mistake?" "On a certainty scale from 1 to 10, I can promise an 8. "Do you realize how that sounds?" "Crazy, I would imagine." 3 men disappear over the Caribbean in 90-degree weather and freeze to death?" Sweat asked no one in particular. "We'll never make this one stick, Doc. Not without a handy frozen food truck." "You've got nothing to stick it to anyway." "Meaning?" "The FBI report came in. Jessie LeBaron's ID was on the money. That isn't her husband in the morgue. The other 2 aren't Buck Caesar or Joseph Cavila either." "God, what next?" Sweat moaned. "Who are they?" "There's no record of them in the FBI's fingerprint files. Best guess is they were foreign nationals." "Did you find anything at all that might give a clue to their identity?" "I can give you their height and weight. I can show you X-rays of their teeth and previous bone fractures. Their livers suggested all 3 favored generous amounts of hard liquor. The lungs gave away their heavy smoking, teeth and fingertips the fact they smoked unfiltered cigarettes. They were also big eaters. Their last meal consisted of dark bread and various fruits and beets. 2 were in their early 30s. 1 was 40 or over. They were in above-average physical condition. Beyond that, I can tell you very little that might pin an ID on them." "It's a start." "But it still leaves us with LeBaron, Caesar, and Cavila among the missing." Before Sweat could reply, A female voice rasped out his boat's call sign over the radio speaker. He answered and turned to another channel frequency as instructed. "Sorry for the interruption," he said to Rooney. "I've got an emergency call over the ship-to-shore phone." Rooney nodded, went into the forward cabin, and poured himself another drink. A delicious glow coursed through his body. He took a few moments to go to the head. When he returned topside to the wheelhouse, Sweat was hanging up the phone, his face red with anger. "The rotten bastards!" he hissed. "What's the problem?" Rooney asked. "They seized them," Sweat said, pounding the helm with his fist. "The damn feds walked into the morgue and seized the bodies from the blimp." "But there are legal procedures to follow," Rooney protested. 6 men in plain clothes and 2 federal marshals showed up with the necessary paperwork, stuffed the corpses into 3 aluminum canisters filled with ice, and took off in a U.S. Navy helicopter. "When did this happen?" "Not 10 minutes ago. Harry Victor, the lead investigator on the case, says they also rifled his desk in the homicide office when he was in the John and ripped off his files." "What about my autopsy report?" "They lifted that, too." The gin had put Rooney in a euphoric mood. "Oh, well, look at it this way. They took you and the department off the hook." Sweat's anger slowly subsided. "I can't deny they did me a favor, but it's their method that pisses me off." "There's one small consolation," mumbled Rooney. He was beginning to have trouble standing. "Uncle Sam didn't get everything." "Like what?" "Something omitted from my report. One lab result that was too controversial to put on paper, too wild to mention outside a loony house." "What are you talking about?" Sweat demanded. "The cause of death." "You said hypothermia." "True, but I left out the best part. You see, I neglected to state the time of death." Rooney's speech was becoming slurred. "Could only be within the last few days." "Oh, no. Those poor guys froze their guts a long time ago." "How long?" "Anywhere from 1 to 2 years ago." Sheriff Sweat stared at Rooney, incredulous. But the coroner stood there grinning like a hyena. He was still grinning when he sagged over the side of the boat and threw up. Chapter 8. The home of Dirk Pitt was not on a suburban street or in a high-rise condominium overlooking the jungled treetops of Washington. There was no landscaped yard or next-door neighbors with squealing children and barking dogs. The house was not a house but an old aircraft hangar that stood on the edge of the capital's international airport. From the outside it appeared deserted. Weeds surrounded the building, and its corrugated walls were weathered and devoid of paint. The only clue remotely suggesting any occupancy was a row of windows running beneath the huge curved roof. Though they were stained and layered with dust, none were shattered like those of an abandoned warehouse. Pitt thanked the airport maintenance man who had given him a lift from the terminal area. Glancing around to see that he wasn't observed, he took a small transmitter from his coat pocket and issued a series of voice commands that closed down the security systems and opened a side door that looked as if it hadn't swung on its hinges for 30 years. He entered and stepped onto a polished concrete floor that held nearly 36 gleaming classic automobiles, an antique airplane, and a turn-of-the-century railroad car. He paused and stared fondly at the chassis of a French Talbot Lago sports coupe that was in an early stage of reconstruction. The car had been nearly destroyed in an explosion, and he was determined to restore the twisted remains to their previous elegance and beauty. He hauled his suitcase and garment bag up a circular staircase to his apartment, elevated against the far wall of the hangar. His watch read 2:15 p.m., but his mind and body felt as though it was closer to midnight. After unpacking his luggage, he decided to spend a few hours working on the Talbot Lago and take a shower later. He had already donned a pair of old coveralls, and his hand was pulling open the drawer of a toolbox when a loud chime echoed through the hangar. He pulled a cordless phone from a deep pocket. "Hello?" "Mr. Pitt, please," said a female voice. "Speaking." "One moment." After waiting for nearly 2 minutes, Pitt cut the connection and began rebuilding the Talbots' distributor. Another 5 minutes passed before the chime sounded again. He opened the line and said nothing. "Are you still there, sir?" asked the same voice. "Yes," Pitt replied indifferently, tucking the phone between his shoulder and ear as he kept working with his hands. "This is Sandra Cabot, Mrs. Jessie LeBaron's personal secretary. Am I talking to Dirk Pitt?" Pitt took an instant dislike to people who couldn't dial their own phone calls. "You are?" "Mrs. LeBaron wishes to meet with you. Can you come to the house at 4 o'clock?" "Pretty fast off the mark, aren't you?" "I beg your pardon?" "Sorry, Miss Cabot, but I have to doctor a sick car. Maybe if Mrs. LeBaron cares to drop by my place, we could talk." "I'm afraid that won't do. She's holding a formal cocktail party in the greenhouse later in the evening that will be attended by the Secretary of State. She can't possibly break away." "Some other time, then." There was an icy silence. Then Miss Cabot said, "You don't understand." "You're right, I don't understand." "Doesn't the name LeBaron mean anything to you?" "No more than Shagnasty, Quagmire, or Smith," Pitt lied fiendishly. She seemed lost for a moment. "Mr. LeBaron—" "We can cut the fun and games," Pitt interrupted. "I'm quite aware of Raymond LeBaron's reputation, and I can save us both time by saying I have nothing to add to the mystery surrounding his disappearance and death. Tell Mrs. LeBaron she has my condolences. That's all I can offer." Cabot took a deep breath and exhaled. "Please, Mr. Pitt, I know she would be most grateful if you could see her." Pitt could almost see her speaking the word please through clenched teeth. "All right," he said. "I guess I can make it. What's the address?" The arrogance quickly returned to her tone. "I'll send the chauffeur to pick you up." "If it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to drive my own car. I get claustrophobic in limousines." "If you insist," she said stiffly. "You'll find the house at the end of Beacon Drive in Great Falls Estates." "I'll check a street map." "By the way, what kind of car do you drive?" "Why do you want to know?" "To inform the guard at the gate." Pitt hesitated and looked across the hangar floor at a car parked by the main door. "An old convertible." "Old?" "Yes, a 1951. "Then would you be so kind to park in the lot by the servants' house? It's to the right as you come up the drive." "Aren't you ever ashamed of the way you dictate to people?" "I don't have to be ashamed of anything, Mr. Pitt. We'll expect you at 4. "Will you be through with me before the guests arrive?" asked Pitt, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "I wouldn't want to embarrass anyone by having them see my old junk car littering the grounds." "Not to worry," she replied testily. "The party doesn't begin until 8. Goodbye." After Sandra Cabot hung up, Pitt walked over to the convertible, staring at it for several moments. He removed the floorboards under the rear seat and clipped on the cables of a battery charger. Then he returned to the Talbot Lago and calmly took up where he left off. At precisely 8:30, the security guard at the LeBaron Estates front gate greeted a young couple driving a yellow Ferrari, checked their names on the party list, and waved them through. Next came a Chrysler limousine carrying the president's chief advisor, Daniel Fawcett, and his wife. The guard was immune to the exotic cars and their celebrity occupants. He raised his hands over his head in a bored stretch and yawned. Then his hands froze in mid-air and his mouth snapped shut as he found himself staring at the largest car he'd ever seen.
This book is continued on Disc 3. Disc 3.
Then his hands froze in mid-air and his mouth snapped shut as he found himself staring at the largest car he'd ever seen. The car was a veritable monster, measuring nearly 22 feet from bumper to bumper and weighing well over 3 tons. The hood and doors were silver gray and the fenders a metallic maroon. A convertible, its top was completely hidden from view when folded down. The body lines were smooth and elegant in the grand manner. an example of flawless craftsmanship seldom equaled. "That's some kind of car," the guard finally said. "What is it?" "A Daimler," replied Pitt. "Sounds British." "It is." The guard shook his head in admiration and looked at his guest list. "Your name, please?" "Pitt." "I can't seem to find your name. Do you have an invitation?" "Mrs. LeBaron and I had an earlier appointment."
The guard went into the gatehouse and checked a clipboard. "Yes, sir, your appointment was for 4 o'clock. When I phoned to say I was running late, she said to join the party." "Well, since she expected you," the guard said, still soaking in the Daimler's lines, "I guess it's all right. Have a good evening." Pitt nodded a thank you and eased the immense car silently up the winding drive to the LeBaron residence. The main building sat on a low hill above a tennis court and a swimming pool. The architecture was common to the area, a 3-story brick colonial with a series of white columns holding up the roof over a long front porch, the wings extending to each side. To the right, a clump of pine trees shielded a carriage house with a garage below, what Pitt assumed were the servants' living quarters. Opposite and to the left of the manor sat a huge glass-enclosed structure, lit by crystal chandeliers hanging from the roof. Exotic flowers and shrubs blossomed around 20 or more dinner tables, while a small orchestra played on a stage beneath a waterfall. Pitt was properly impressed. The perfect setting for a party on a brisk October evening. Raymond LeBaron got high marks for originality. He pulled the Daimler up to the front of the greenhouse, where a liveried parking valet stood with the awed expression of a carpenter gazing at redwoods. As he slid from behind the wheel and straightened the jacket of his tuxedo, Pitt noticed a crowd beginning to gather behind the transparent wall of the greenhouse, pointing and gesturing at the car. He gave the valet instructions on how to shift the transmission and then passed through the glass doors. The orchestra was playing themes from John Barry scores, light on the brass and heavy on the strings. A woman, elegantly dressed in the latest designer fashion, was standing just inside the entrance, greeting the guests. He had no doubt she was Jessie LeBaron. Cool composure, the embodiment of grace and style, the living proof women can be beautiful after 50. She wore a glittery beaded green and silver tunic over a long, slim velvet skirt. Pitt approached and gave a brief bow. "Good evening," he said, flashing his best gate-crasher's smile. "What is that sensational car?" Jessie asked, peering through the doorway. "A Daimler, powered by a 5.4-liter straight-eight engine with Hooper coachwork." She smiled graciously and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming, Mr.—" She hesitated, gazing at him curiously. "Forgive me, but I don't seem to recall meeting you before." "That's because we've never laid eyes on each other," he said, marveling at her throaty voice, almost husky, with a sensual coarseness about it. "My name is Pitt, Dirk Pitt." Jessie's dark eyes looked at Pitt in a most peculiar way. "You're 4.5 hours late, Mr. Pitt. Did you suffer some sort of accidental delay?" "No accident, Mrs. LeBaron. I planned my arrival most carefully." "You weren't invited to the party," she said smoothly, "so you'll have to leave." "A pity," said Pitt mournfully. "I seldom get a chance to wear my tux." Jessie's face registered scorn. She turned to a prim woman wearing large-lensed glasses and standing slightly to her rear, who Pitt guessed was her secretary, Sandra Cabot. "Find Angelo and tell him to show this gentleman out." Pitt's green eyes glinted mischievously. "I seem to have a talent for spreading ill will. Do you wish me to go peacefully or cause a nasty scene?" "I think peacefully would be best." "Then why did you ask to meet with me?" "A matter concerning my husband." "He was a perfect stranger to me. I can't tell you anything about his death that you don't already know." "Raymond is not dead," she said adamantly. "When I saw him in the blimp, he gave a damn good imitation of it." "That wasn't him." Pitt stared at her skeptically, saying nothing. "You don't believe me, do you?" "I don't really care." I was hoping you'd help me." "You have a strange way of asking for favors." "This is a formal charity dinner, Mr. Pitt. You don't fit in. We'll set a time to meet tomorrow." Pitt decided his anger wasn't important, so he shoved it aside. "What was your husband doing when he disappeared?" he asked abruptly. "Searching for the El Dorado treasure," she replied, looking nervously around the greenhouse at her guests. "He believed it sank on a ship called the Cyclops." Before Pitt could make a comment, Cabot returned with Angelo, the Cuban chauffeur. "Goodbye, Mr. Pitt," said Jessie, dismissing him and greeting a pair of new arrivals. Pitt shrugged and offered his arm to Angelo. "Let's make it official. You lead me out." Then he turned to Jessie. "One last thing, Mrs. LeBaron. I don't respond to shabby treatment. You needn't bother to contact me again. Ever." Then Pitt allowed Angelo to escort him from the greenhouse to the driveway where the Daimler was waiting. Jessie watched as the great car disappeared into the night. Then she began mingling with her guests. Douglas Oates, the Secretary of State, looked over from a conversation he was having with presidential advisor Daniel Fawcett as she approached. "Splendid affair, Jessie." "Yes, indeed," echoed Fawcett. "Nobody in Washington puts on a finer spread." Jessie's eyes flashed and her full lips curved in a warm smile. "Thank you, gentlemen." Oates nodded toward the doorway. "Was I imagining things, or did I see Dirk Pitt bounced out the door?" Jessie looked at Oates blankly. "You know him?" she asked, surprised. "Of course. Pitt is the number 2 man over at Numa. He's the guy who raised the Titanic for the Defense Department." "And saved the president's life in Louisiana," added Fawcett. Jessie noticeably paled. "I had no idea." "I hope you didn't make him mad," said Oates. "Perhaps I was a bit rude," she conceded. "Aren't you interested in drilling for offshore oil below San Diego?" "Yes. The seismic surveys indicate a vast untapped field. One of our companies has the inside track for the drilling rights. Why do you ask?" "Don't you know who heads up the Senate Committee for Oil Exploration on Government Lands?" "Certainly, it's—" Jessie's voice trailed off and her composure melted away. "Dirk's father," Oates finished. "Senator George Pitt of California. Without his backing and the blessing of Numa on environmental issues, you don't stand a prayer of winning the drilling rights." "It would appear," Fawcett said sardonically, "your inside track just washed out." Chapter 9. 30 minutes later, Pitt rolled the Daimler into his parking stall in front of the tall, solar-glassed building that housed Numa headquarters. He signed in at the security desk and took the elevator to the 10th floor. When the doors opened, he stepped into a vast electronic maze, comprising the communications and information network of the Marine Agency. Hiram Yeager looked up from behind a horseshoe-shaped desk, whose surface lay unseen beneath a jungle of computer hardware, and smiled. "Hello, Dirk. All dressed up and no place to go?" "The party's hostess decided I was persona non grata and made me walk the plank." "Anybody I know?" It was Pitt's turn to smile. He looked down at Yeager. The computer wizard was a throwback to the hippie days of the early 70s. He wore his blond hair long and tied in a ponytail. His beard was untrimmed and kinky with uncontrolled curls. And his standard uniform for work and play was Levi jacket and pants stuffed into scruffy cowboy boots. Pitt said, "I can't picture you and Jessie LeBaron traveling in the same social circles." Yeager gave out a low whistle. "You got booted from a Jessie LeBaron bash? Man, you're some kind of hero to the downtrodden. Are you in the mood for an excavation?" "On her?" "On him." "Her husband? The one who's missing?" "Raymond LeBaron." "Another moonlight operation?" "Whatever you want to call it." "Dirk," Yeager said, peering over the rims of his granny glasses, "you are a nosy bastard, but I love you just the same. I'm hired to build a world-class computer network and amass an archive on marine science and history. But every time I belch, you turn up, wanting to use my creation for shady purposes. Why do I go along? Okay, I'll tell you why. Larceny flows faster in my veins than yours. Now, how deep do you want me to dig? To the bottom of his past, where he came from, what was the money base for his empire. Raymond LeBaron was pretty secretive about his private life. He may have covered his trail. I realize that, but you've pulled skeletons out of the closet before. Yeager nodded thoughtfully. Yes, the Bougainville shipping family a few months ago. A neat little caper, if I do say so. One more thing. Lay it on me. A ship called the Cyclops. Could you pull her history for me? No sweat. Anything else? That should do it, Pitt answered. Yeager stared at him. What's going down this time, old friend? I can't believe you're going after the LeBarons because you were dumped at a society party. Take me, I've been thrown out of the worst sleaze joints in town, and I just accept it. Pitt laughed. No revenge, I'm just curious. Jessie LeBaron said something that struck me odd about her husband's disappearance. I read about it in the Washington Post. There was a paragraph mentioning you as the hero of the hour, saving LeBaron's blimp with your rope and palm tree trick. So what's the catch? She claimed that her husband wasn't among the dead I found inside the control cabin. Yeager paused, his eyes uncomprehending. Doesn't make sense. If old man LeBaron flew off in that gas bag, it stands to reason he'd still be inside when it turned up. Not according to the bereaved wife. Think she's got an angle, insurance or financial? Maybe, maybe not. But there is a chance that because the mystery occurred over water, Numa will be called in to assist in the investigation. And we'll already be on first base. Something like that. Where does the Cyclops fit in the picture? She told me LeBaron was looking for it when he vanished. Yeager rose from his chair. All right, then, let's get off the mark. While I design a search program, you study what we have on the ship in our data files. He led Pitt into a small viewing theater with a large monitor mounted on the far wall, and motioned for him to sit behind a console containing a computer keyboard. Then he leaned over Pitt and pressed a series of commands on the keyboard. We installed a new system last week. The terminal is hooked into a voice synthesizer. A talking computer, said Pitt. Yes, it can comprehend over 10,000 verbal commands, make the appropriate reply, and actually carry on a conversation. The voice sounds a little weird, sort of like Hal, the giant computer in the movie 2001, but you get used to it. We call her Hope. Hope? Yeah, we hope she'll come up with the right answers. Funny. I'll be at the main terminal desk if you need help. Just pick up the phone and dial 47. Pitt looked up at the screen. It had a bluish-gray cast. He warily picked up a microphone and spoke into it. Hope, my name is Dirk. Are you ready to conduct a search for me? God, he felt like an idiot. It was like talking to a tree and expecting a reply. Hello, Dirk, replied a vaguely female voice that sounded as if it was coming out of a harmonica. Ready when you are. Pitt took a deep breath and made the plunge. Hope, I'd like you to tell me about a ship named Cyclops. There was a 5-second pause, then the computer said, You will have to be more specific. My memory disks contain data on 5 different vessels called Cyclops. This one had treasure on board. Sorry, none show any treasure in their cargo manifest. Sorry. Pitt still couldn't believe he was conversing with a machine. If I may digress for a moment, Hope, allow me to say you're a very bright and most congenial computer. Thank you for the compliment, Dirk. In case you're interested, I can also do sound effects, imitate animals, sing, though not too well, and pronounce supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, even if I haven't been programmed to its exact definition. Would you like me to say it backwards? Pitt laughed. Some other time. Getting back to the Cyclops, the one I'm interested in probably sank in the Caribbean. That narrows it down to 2. A small steamer that ran aground in Montego Bay, Jamaica, 5 May 1968, and a U.S. Navy collier, an ore or coal transport, lost without a trace, between 5 and 10 February 1918. Raymond LeBaron wouldn't be flying around searching for a ship stranded in a busy harbor only 20 years ago, Pitt reasoned. The tale of the Navy collier came back to him. The loss was touted as one of the great mysteries of the mythical Bermuda Triangle. "We'll go with the Navy collier," said Pitt. "If you wish me to print out the data for you, Dirk, press the control button on your keyboard and the letters PT. Also, if you watch the screen, I can project whatever photos are available." Pitt did as he was told, and the printer began pounding away. True to her word, Hope flashed a picture of the Cyclops lying at anchor in an unnamed port. Although her hull was slender, with its old-fashioned straight-up-and-down bow and graceful...
What's up, Sawston? How you doing, man?
champagne glass stern, her superstructure had the look of a child's erector set gone wild. A maze of derricks, spider-webbed by cables and laced by overhead supports, rose amidships like a dead forest. A long deck-house ran along the aft part of the ship above the engine-room, its roof festooned with towering twin smokestacks and several tall ventilators. Forward, the wheelhouse perched above the main deck like a vanity table on 4 legs, spotted with a single row of portholes and open beneath. 2 high masts with a crossbar protruded from a bridge that could have passed for a football goalpost. She seemed ungainly, an ugly duckling that never made it to Swan. There was also a ghostly quality about her. At first Pitt couldn't put his finger on it, and then it struck him. Oddly, no crew member was visible anywhere on her decks. It was as if she were deserted. Pitt turned from the monitor and scanned the printout of the ship's statistics. Launched 7 May 1910 by William Cramp & Sons, Shipbuilders, Philadelphia. Tonnage 19,360 displaced. Length 542 feet, actually longer than the battleships of her time. Beam 65 feet. Draft 27 feet 8 inches. Speed 15 knots, 3 knots faster than the Liberty ships of World War II. Armament 4 4-inch guns. Crew 246. Master G. W. Worley, Naval Auxiliary Service. Pitt noted that Worley was the Cyclops captain from the time she was placed in service until she disappeared. He sat back, his mind drifting as he studied the picture of the ship. "Do you have any other photographs of her?" he asked Hope. 3 from the same angle, 1 stern shot, and 4 of the crew. Let's have a look at the crew. The monitor went black for a moment, and soon an image of a man, standing at a ship's railing and holding a little girl's hand, came into view. "Captain Worley with his daughter," explained Hope. A huge man with thinning hair, neatly trimmed mustache, and massive hands stood in a dark suit, necktie casually askew outside the jacket, shoes highly shined, staring into a camera that froze his image 75 years ago. The little blonde girl at his side wore a knee-length jumper and a little hat, and gripped what looked to be a very rigid doll in the shape of a bottle. Real name was Johann Wickman, Hope briefed without command. He was born in Germany and illegally entered the United States when he jumped a merchant ship in San Francisco during the year 1878. How he falsified his records is not known. While commanding the Cyclops, he lived in Norfolk, Virginia, with his wife and daughter. Any possibility he was working for the Germans in 1918? Nothing was ever proven. Would you like the reports from naval investigations of the tragedy? Just print them out. I'll study them later. The next photo is of Lieutenant David Forbes, the executive officer, said Hope. The camera had caught Forbes in dress uniform, standing beside what Pitt guessed to be a 1916 Cadillac touring car. He had the face of a greyhound, long, narrow nose, pale eyes whose color could not be determined from the black and white photograph. His face was clean-shaven, the eyebrows arched, and he had slightly protruding teeth. "What sort of man was he?" asked Pitt. His naval record was unblemished until Worley put him under ship's arrest for insubordination. Reason? Captain Worley altered course from one plotted by Lieutenant Forbes and almost wrecked the ship entering Rio. When Forbes demanded to know why, Worley blew up and confined him to quarters. Was Forbes still under arrest during the last voyage? Yes. Who's next? Lieutenant John Church, second officer. The photo showed a small, almost frail-looking man in civilian clothes sitting at a table in a restaurant. His face wore the tired look of a farmer after a long day in the fields, yet his dark eyes seemed to advertise a humorous disposition. The graying hair above a large forehead was brushed back over small ears. "He seems older than the others," observed Pitt. "Actually only 29, said Hope. "Joined the Navy when he was 16 and worked his way up through the ranks." "Did he have problems with Worley?" "Nothing in the file." The final photograph was of two men standing at attention in a courtroom. There was no sign of apprehension in their faces. If anything, they appeared sullen and defiant. The one on the left was tall and rangy with heavily muscled arms. The other one had the size and shape of a grizzly bear. This picture was taken at the court-martial of Fireman First Class James Coker and Fireman Second Class Barney DeVoe for the murder of Fireman Third Class Oscar Stewart. All three men were stationed aboard the U.S. cruiser Pittsburgh. Coker, on the left, was sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out in Brazil. DeVoe, on the right, was sentenced to 50 to 99 years in the naval prison at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. "What's their connection with the Cyclops?" Pitt inquired. The Pittsburgh was in Rio de Janeiro when the murder occurred. When Captain Worley reached port, he was instructed to transport DeVoe and 4 other prisoners in the Cyclops brig to the United States. "And they were on board at the end?" "Yes." "No other pictures of the crew?" "They are probably available in family albums and other private sources, but this is all I have in my library." "Tell me about the events leading to the disappearance. Verbal or print? Can you print it out and talk at the same time?" "Sorry, I can only perform such functions in sequence. Which do you prefer first?" "Verbal." "Very well. One moment while I assemble the data." Pitt was beginning to feel drowsy. It had been a long day. He used the pause to dial Jaeger and ask for a cup of coffee. "How are you and Hope getting along?" "I'm almost beginning to think she's real," Pitt answered. "Just so long as you don't start fantasizing about her non-existent body." "I'm not at that stage yet. To know her is to love her." "How are you doing on LeBaron?" "What I was afraid of," said Jaeger. "He pretty much buried his past. No insight, only statistics up to the time he became the Wall Street whiz." "Anything interesting?" "Not really. He came from a fairly affluent family. His father owned a chain of hardware stores. I get the idea Raymond and his father didn't get along. There's no mention of his family in any newspaper biographies after he became the financial whiz." "Did you find out how he made his first big bucks?" "That area is pretty vague. He and a partner by the name of Kronberg had a marine salvage company in the middle 1950s. Seems they scratched along for a few years and then went broke. 2 years later, Raymond launched his publication." "The Prospertier." "Right." "Is there any mention of where his backing came from?" "None," replied Jaeger. "By the way, Jessie is his second wife. His first was named Hillary. She died a few years ago. Nothing on her at all." "Keep hunting." Pitt hung up as Hope said, "I'm ready with the data on the ill-fated final voyage of the Cyclops." "Let's hear it." "She put to sea from Rio de Janeiro on 16 February 1918. bound for Baltimore, Maryland. On board were her regular crew of 15 officers and 231 men, 57 men from the cruiser Pittsburgh, who were being rotated to the Norfolk Navy Base for reassignment, the 5 prisoners including DeVoe, and the American Consul General at Rio, Alfred L. Maureen Gottschalk, who was returning to Washington. Her cargo was 11,000 tons of manganese ore. After a brief call at the port of Bahia to pick up mail, the ship made an unscheduled stop on 4 March, when she entered Carlisle Bay on the island of Barbados and dropped anchor. Here Worley took on extra coal and provisions, which he claimed were necessary to continue the voyage to Baltimore, but was later considered to be quite excessive. After the ship was lost at sea, the American consul in Barbados reported a number of suspicious rumors regarding Worley's unusual action, strange events on board, and a possible mutiny. The last anyone saw of the Cyclops and the men on board was 4 March 1918, when she steamed away from Barbados. There was no further contact? Asked Pitt. 24 hours later, a lumber freighter called the Croghan Castle reported her bow crushed by an immense freak wave. Her radio signals for assistance were answered by the Cyclops. The final words from the collier were her call number and the message, "We are 50 miles due south of you and coming at full steam." Nothing else? That was it. Did the Croghan Castle give her position? Yes, it was reported as latitude 23 degrees 30 minutes north by longitude 79 degrees 21 minutes west, which put her about 20 miles southeast from a bank of shallow reefs called the Anguilla Keys. Was the Croghan Castle lost also? No, the records say she limped into Havana. Any wreckage of the Cyclops turn up? An extensive search by the Navy found nothing. Pitt hesitated as Yeager entered the viewing room, set a cup of coffee by the console, and silently retreated. He took a few sips and asked Hope to re-show the photo of the Cyclops. The ship materialized on the monitor's screen, and he stared at it thoughtfully. He picked up the phone, punched a number, and waited. A digital clock on the console read 11:55. But the voice that answered sounded bright and cheerful. "Dirk!" boomed Dr. Raphael O'Mara. "What the hell is going down? You caught me at a good time. I just came home this morning from a dig in Costa Rica." "Find another truckload of potsherds?" "Only the richest cache of pre-Columbian art discovered to date. Amazing pieces, some dating back to 300 B.C. "Too bad you can't keep them." "All my finds go to the Museo Nacional de Costa Rica." "You're a generous man, Raphael." "I don't donate them, Dirk. The governments where my finds are made preserve the artifacts as part of their national heritage. But why bore an old waterlogged relic like you? To what do I owe the pleasure of your call?" "I need your expertise on a piece of treasure." "You know, of course," O'Mara said, his tone edged with a touch of seriousness, "treasure is an unspeakable word to a respected archaeologist." "We all carry an albatross," said Pitt. "Can you meet me for a drink?" "Now? Do you realize what time it is?" "I happen to know you're a night owl. Make it easy on yourself, someplace close to your house." "How about the Old Anglers Inn on MacArthur Boulevard, say in half an hour?" "Sounds good." "Can you tell me what treasure you're interested in?" "The one everyone dreams about." "Oh, and which one is that?" "Tell you when I see you." Pitt hung up and gazed at the Cyclops. There was an eerie loneliness about her. He could not help wondering what secrets she took with her to a watery grave. "Can I provide any further data?" asked Hope, interrupting his morbid reverie. "Or do you wish to terminate?" "I think we can call it quits," he replied. "Thank you, Hope. I wish I could give you a big kiss." "I am grateful for the compliment, Dirk, but I am not physiologically capable of receiving a kiss." "You're still a sweetheart in my book. Come up and use me any time." Pitt laughed. "Good night, Hope." "Good night, Dirk." If only she was real, he thought with a dreamy sigh. Chapter 10. Jack Daniels neat, Raphael O'Mara said cheerfully. Make that a double. Best medicine I know to clear the brain of jungle rot. How long were you in Costa Rica? Asked Pitt. 3 months. Rain the whole time. Bombay gin on the rocks with a twist, Pitt said to the barmaid. So you're joining the greedy ranks of the sea scavengers, O'Mara said, the words emanating through a thick, gabby beard that hid his face from the nose down. Dirk Pitt, a treasure hunter. I never thought I'd see the day. My interest is purely academic. Sure, that's what they all say. Take my advice and forget it. More loot has been poured into underwater treasure hunts than was ever found. I can count on one hand the number of lucky discoveries that paid a profit in the last 80 years. The adventure, excitement, and riches, nothing but hype and all myth. I agree. O'Mara's barbed wire eyebrows narrowed. So what is it you want to know? Are you familiar with Raymond LeBaron? Old rich and reckless Raymond, the financial genius who publishes the Prosperiteur? The same. He disappeared a couple of weeks ago on a blimp flight near the Bahamas. How could anybody disappear in a blimp? Somehow he managed. You must have heard or read something about it. O'Mara shook his head. I haven't watched TV or seen a newspaper in 90 days. The drinks were brought, and Pitt briefly explained the strange circumstances surrounding the mystery. The crowd was beginning to thin, and they had the bar mostly to themselves. And you think LeBaron was flying around in an old gas bag looking for a shipwreck loaded to the gills with the mother lode? According to his wife, Jessie. What ship? The Cyclops. I know about the Cyclops. A Navy collier that vanished 71 years ago. I don't recall any report of riches on board. Apparently LeBaron thought so. What sort of treasure? The El Dorado. You've got to be kidding. I'm only repeating what I was told. O'Mara went quiet for a long moment, his eyes taking on a faraway look. El Hombre Dorado, he said at last. Spanish for the golden man or the gilded one. The legend, some call it a curse, has fired imaginations for 450 years. Is there any truth to it? Asked Pitt. Every legend is based on fact, but like all the others before and since, this one has been distorted and embellished into a fairy tale. El Dorado has inspired the longest continuing treasure hunt on record. Thousands of men have died searching for a glimpse of it. Tell me how the tale originated. Another Jack Daniels and Bombay gin arrived. Pitt laughed as O'Mara downed the water chaser first. Then the archaeologist made himself comfortable and stared into another time. The Spanish conquistadores were the first to hear of a gilded man who ruled an incredibly wealthy kingdom somewhere in the mountainous jungles east of the Andes. Rumors described him as living in a secluded city built of gold, with streets paved in emeralds and guarded by a fierce army of beautiful Amazons. Made Oz sound like a slum. Extremely overvalued, of course. But in reality there were a number of El Dorados. A long line of kings who worshipped a demon god who lived in Lake Vita, Colombia. When a new monarch took command of the tribal empire, his body was painted with resinous gums and then coated with gold dust, thus the gilded man. Then he was placed on a ceremonial raft, piled high with gold and precious stones, and rowed into the middle of the lake, where he proceeded to pitch the riches into the water as an offering to the god, whose name escapes me. Was the treasure ever raised? There were any number of attempts to drain the lake, but they all failed. In 1965, the government of Colombia declared Guatavita an area of cultural interest and banned all salvage operations. A pity, when you consider that estimates of the wealth on the bottom of the lake run between $100 and $300 million. And the Golden City? Never found, said O'Mara, signaling the barmaid for another round. Many looked and many died. Nicolaus Federman, Ambrosius Dalfinger, Sebastian de Belalcazar, Gonzalo and Hernan Jimenez de Quesada, All sought El Dorado, but only found the curse. So did Sir Walter Raleigh. After his second fruitless expedition, King James put his head on the block, literally. The fabulous city of El Dorado and the greatest treasure of them all remained lost. "Let's back up a minute," said Pitt. "The treasure at the bottom of the lake is not lost." "Well, that's in scattered pieces," explained O'Mara. "The second one, the grand prize, the bonanza at the end of the rainbow, remains hidden to this day. With maybe 2 exceptions, no outsider has ever laid eyes on it. The only description came from a monk who wandered out of the jungle into a Spanish settlement on the Orinoco River in 1675. Before dying a week later, he told of being on a Portuguese expedition looking for diamond mines. Out of 80 men, he was the only survivor. He claimed they'd stumbled into a deserted city surrounded by high cliffs and guarded by a tribe who called themselves Zanonas. The party lived in the city for 3 months, but one by one the men began to die off. Too late they discovered the Zanonas were not as friendly as they made out, but were cannibals, poisoning the Portuguese and eating them. The monk alone managed to escape. He described massive temples and buildings, strange inscriptions, and the legendary treasure that sent so many of its hunters to their graves. "A true golden man," Pitt speculated, "a statue." "You're close," said O'Mara. "Damn close, but you missed on the sex." "Sex?" "La Mujer Dorada," the Golden Woman, O'Mara replied, or more commonly La Dorada. You see, the name first applied to a man and a ceremony, later to a city, and finally to an empire. Over the years it became a term for any place where riches could be found on the ground. Like so many descriptions the feminists hate, the masculine myth became generic, while the feminine was forgotten.
Hey, this is wanting me to do an update and it's jamming up the camera. So I'm going to have to go ahead and do this update and restart the computer, and then I'll be back on live in a minute and we'll pick up where we left off.